Lux Occult is part of the Green Mushroom Podcast Network.
3, 2, Romeo, 7, Bravo, Delta, Quebec, Oscar,
Within the white cell walls, eternal Sunday crawls, with never a coming Monday to break the monotony. In the narrow courtyard, there isn't even space for walls so old and tired to lie down as I pass. In the narrow courtyard, in the banal hall, no space here to be dared, but vertical. Words feel strange and wrong, like an angel tongue. My loves, my friends, what then can be the horizon? These Sundays without end, and these bare plank beds, the interminable hell of nighttime chill. Oh, nights of 14 hours, where only dreams allow some kind of flight. Oh, velvet night. The chill could split a boulder, a cat with fur like coal upon the ruin of my chest curls up to rest. A voice as gray as ash within the dark and hush calls me gently through. I am waiting for you. The sun on the bright sand, I barely comprehend. The gardens are too green. Is that it, the sea? Tomorrow may be at dawn. That was Lullaby for One Condemned to Death by Claude Ka, written on the 19th and 20th of February 1945, and translated by Andy Eisenson. Hello and welcome to Lux Occult. This is the podcast where we gleefully taunt the mundane, butcher the Latin and most other languages, and we also discuss a variety of occult, esoteric, and adjacent topics, exploring the intersections of magic, art, philosophy, technology, and so much more through the lens of chaos magic. This is occultism for everyone. I'm your host, Lux Estrada, and if you're hearing the sound of my voice right now, that means that this show, and magic for that matter, are for you if you want them. There are a lot of different ways to be more free in the world, and using magic or making space for a spiritual practice in your life can be one of them. As always, I do not speak for anybody but myself. Others can, will, and should disagree sometimes with the things that I or my guests say on the show. How will we ever learn anything if we were all in agreement on all things at all times after all? Unlike those who attempt to be reasonable, should always be willing to do, I can and often do advise my opinions or thoughts about things based on new evidence. All right, very excited to share another thick and juicy episode with you all. First up, I had an amazing conversation with Mortellus about their book Necrobotany and about plants, necromancy, and lots of other very fun topics. Mortellus shares their perspectives as a magician who works in the funeral industry, as well as getting into a lot of cool stuff about history. Mortellus will tell me about an incense they create out of funeral flowers and share about ways of appreciating the death that exists all around us and which supports us. We talk about necromancy in the Grimoire traditions and elsewhere, and Mortellus will dispel some myths surrounding the idea of necromancy in popular culture. And here's a bit of a spoiler, you may already be doing it. For the episode within the episode, I'm joined by CJ Lane to talk about his new poetry project, Caught One Glimpse. He used a cut-up method and passages from the Greek Magical Papyri to create poems, which are also spells. We're going to talk about the process that CJ uses and get into some cool stuff about the PGM as a text, language, and more. And CJ will also share a poetry snack with us. I'll also share an update about what we have going on with the Green Mushroom Project, a large-scale group working which you can be a part of, as well as Void House, our newest adventure, in which we are creating a consent-forward space to do magical work both in person and online, as well as providing consent education to the magically inclined and investigating the magical healing and alchemical properties of consent. I'm also going to get into some listener mail later, in which I will answer a very interesting question that I received on Instagram. So we have a lot of really cool stuff to get into here today. But before we do, let me remind you that if you like the show and the other work I've been getting into, you can support it on Patreon. If you do so, you could take a bibliomancy break with me, and there are no tiers or levels or whatever, so give as you will. Patreon has recently switched over to a subscription model, so things might look a little bit different with billing. Just wanted to put a bug in people's ear about that. So things are changing over on the Patreon side because Patreon is changing the way that they are doing things. Buy Me a Coffee is also an option for those who wish to show their support with a one-time donation. Thanks so much to everybody who is already doing this in some fashion or another. Your support literally makes this show possible by allowing me to cover the expenses associated with making it, which seem to rise on a daily basis, as is life. This allows me to justify the kind of wild amount of time that I spend in production and elsewhere. So many thanks to the support, which is making this show possible. Fuck yeah. Although I'm a pretty introverted person and I don't use social media very much due to this, I'm not always there checking on things every day or anything like that. It certainly doesn't mean I don't want to hear from you or anything like that. I'm beyond lucky to have such amazing listeners, collaborators, cohorts, co-conspirators, etc. I always welcome people's thoughts, questions, comments, suggestions, or arcane revelations for that listener mailbag. You can get me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com, or you can get me on Instagram at luxoccultpod, or find me now on Blue Sky at luxastrata919. So that's LUXASTRATA number 919. All right, very stoked to share this first conversation with you all today. Let me go ahead and introduce my first guest, Mortellus. Mortellus is a lineage 3rd degree Gardnerian high priestess, mortician, necromancer, medium, and world-renowned thought leader in death care and the magic of death. In addition to their degrees in mortuary sciences, Mortellus holds degrees in design, education, and fine arts. Their areas of expertise include necromancy, botany, mediumship, and the funerary rites of minority faith groups. Currently residing in western North Carolina on 3 acres that doubles as the coven stead for the Coven of Leaves with their spouse and twin children. Their adult child, who resides in Asheville, North Carolina, is a student of health sciences. All right, I'll be back during a break to talk about the Green Mushroom Project, and I'll let you know about the call for submissions that we have going on for Fuck Around and Find Out Part 3. But now, let's go ahead and get to the first part of my chat with Mortellus.
November, Delta, Romeo, Hotel, Whiskey, Romeo, November, Golf, Tango, Romeo, Tango.
All right, well, my guest today is Mortellus. Mortellus, how's it going?
It's going great. Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, I'm so stoked to talk with you today. So maybe we could start out with giving the listeners whatever context you would like them to have about you kind of going into this conversation.
Oh, dear God. So I guess the best way to describe me to your listeners would be to say that I'm actually really bad at being like a used car salesman for myself. I'm the worst at this. This is terrible. I'm an author. I write stuff. I'm a mortician. I do death care work. As a magical practitioner, of course, I do necromancy because it's centered around my mundane life quite a bit. And I'm a 3rd degree Gardnerian Wiccan priestess. If anyone knows much about Gardnerian magic, they heard that term I just made up and went, do explain more. I am a non-binary person, so I use they, them pronouns, and generally like to just stir the pot in my very stodgy tradition, I guess.
Yeah, fuck yeah. The term priestess is one that I've encountered elsewhere and I've also used as a nomiker for the work that I do with Hecate. So I fucking love it. Hell yeah.
Awesome. I think, yeah, that's an interesting comment because working with deities, it's weird that we try and constrain them to these very human gendered ideas. I work with the Morrigan quite a bit in my private practice, and I always use they, them pronouns for them, not because I believe the Morrigan is non-binary, but because they're more than one fucking person.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that totally tracks, dude. Totally.
It is weird that we, she, her, a group of people
That is very strange. I had never kind of parsed out the semantics of that before, but that is a great point.
We have weird relationships with deities, I think, sometimes. And like, you could get into the whole debate about whether these are like sort of Jungian perfect forms or literal deity in the literal mythological sense, or constructs that we as people are building, or useful psychological parameters. I say yes to all of those, so I'm that guy. But yeah, the way we interact and sort of humanize what defies being humanized is, I think, really fascinating human behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, for people in my circles, you might sort of contextualize what you said as like, being into the meta model of like, there's all these different ways of like looking at what might be going on. And for me personally, like figuring out what the actual ontological quote truth of the matter, that's much less interesting and much less useful than playing in whatever space presents itself, depending on what I'm doing. So yeah.
Right. I'm going to assume super broadly you're familiar with the concept of perfect forms.
Sure, like in terms of like Plato and
Yes.
the idea of like, yes, this kind of whatever makes a chair, its cherishness coming down from this kind of ethereal realm and manifesting in these imperfect ways here on Earth, I suppose, is kind of illustrated in the Western Hermeticism version of the Kabbalah and things like that too, right?
And for your listeners, one of my favorite bits of the sort of perfect form ideology is not just, what you described just now, but the idea that you cannot destroy a chair. If we took everything we considered to be a chair on the planet and, threw it in a bonfire, we would still find a fucking thing to sit on, and people would still have this concept that lives inside them of what that is, and you cannot like erase that. And I think deities are that way. Like, let's say we had some kind of apocalyptic scenario and we've lost all connection to like the written word or current past knowledge or whatever. That can't happen, but here we are. You can't erase the idea of like a horned hunting god, because people are going to make that exist even if it doesn't, because they all want the shape of something that fills a role. We're all going to imagine a war goddess because we need something that looks like ourselves, that personifies a kind of empowerment that we need, right? Like, I do think that's an interesting way to view deities outside of any of the other sort of things. Just the very idea that if that was not there, we would make it.
Yeah. Yeah, I tend to suspect that might be the case as well.
I feel like I'm getting off on a weird foot here.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, I was just thinking, well, wait, this is a little detour into deities and what are the gods. I actually really love this topic. I could stay here for quite some time, but I don't want to linger here for too long because we have all kinds of other interesting territory to explore, like your new book, Necrobotany.
I know, I'm very excited. I love that the people of the world will let me just make up a thing and cause it to exist.
That's how some of the best things come into being, right? Hell yeah.
I mean, from your background, I'm sure you're very, very aware that plants have always had a really intimate connection with death and dying and just sort of human rituals and practicalities surrounding death. And just from the standpoint of someone who went to mortuary sciences school and then went on to participate in that industry, I've always been really, really fascinated with the way that plants play just such a huge role in the mourning, grieving, and funerary experience of modern people. And then when we sort of look back on what that was historically, it grows around that idea. But for me, living in Western North Carolina, here in the South, and just this sort of beautiful, verdant area that I'm in, planting and gardening has always been a huge part of my experience. Some of my best memories growing up, and let me tell you, that's a very low bar I just set. The one who's heard me talk anywhere knows that was a very low bar. For those who don't, my parents are not the best people, but yeah, some of my best experiences growing up were gardening with my grandmother, and going out and planting rows of beans, watching crows steal them, planting more rows of beans, watching the crows steal them, planting yet more, standing over them with a hoe and yelling at crows. These are very real.
The cycle of gardening.
The cycle of gardening, as it is. And then, going out there with a big stainless steel bowl and picking string beans and then sitting on the porch breaking them and canning them and all that stuff. It's just a big part of my life. And I found myself over time trying to sort of bring those ideas together. Like, what is this current existence for me, both from a career standpoint and a magical standpoint, where everything is death, contrasted with this part of my life that's very sort of verdant and alive. And I started thinking about the ways that I bring those two worlds together. Like, yeah, I have an old mort safe out in the yard. If you're familiar, there are these iron cages that they would sometimes put over graves to prevent people from grave robbing. And I have one used as like a tomato cage, basically. I plant lots of things in a local cemetery that's been sort of abandoned. I go out there and mow and take care of the place and plant all kinds of herbs and stuff that I use in my work and in the items that I have for sale on my website if you want to pitch.
Cool. Yeah, that's really cool. I love like doing that kind of like really deep, in-depth, long-term type of work. That's rad.
Yeah, exactly. And there's I don't know, I feel like I'm getting into a ramble, and that's probably owing to the fact that I've been awake for like 36 hours.
In podcasting, we just call that content. Ramble away.
Right, exactly. But yeah, I think that for me, fundamentally, necromancy is about reclaiming things and giving them a new life, right? You're, even in the most cartoonish, video gamey sense, you're taking a corpse and giving it new life, right? You're giving it a purpose, probably to fight for you in Diablo or whatever. But on a more day-to-day level, I think that can be things like, I say this often, but microwaving food. You're taking the remains of something and then reanimating it to derive life from. We do little things like that all the time. We just don't contextualize them as that kind of work. And the funeral industry as a whole has an incredible amount of waste. So a lot of my work centers around sort of reclaiming that waste and giving it a new life. Things like the many, 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 many coffins and caskets that wind up in landfills every day, the literal dumpsters full of flowers at the end of any funeral. You know, I will go out and I'll gather up those flowers that are left behind after services and dry them. I use them to make incense and other materials and goods. Just those kinds of small things that take what was left behind and make it something new.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things I'm thinking of here in this story. Like even this idea of, you know, this performative act of like having this funeral and like we're going to be offering these flowers to this like, you know, dead person in remembrance. But then like once this performative act is over, we just like cast it away and forget about it. And like,
seriously,
I like the idea of like really bringing that home and honoring it. That's really beautiful.
I have an incense. I don't always offer it on my website. Sometimes it's called Remembrance Incense, and it is specifically and only a blend of dried flowers left behind at funerals. I wait until I have enough of any, you know, particular thing and put them together. But yeah, it is really interesting how we treat that. You hear that your uncle died. Maybe you're not flying in from out of town to go to the funeral. Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. But you'll probably send flowers. And at the end of the service, maybe the family has chosen to ask the funeral home to take them all to the graveside. Maybe not. And even if they did, they're going to be abandoned in the cemetery. And at the end of the day, after everyone is left and the gravedigger finishes filling in the grave, they're going to put the handful that they think will last the longest on top, and the others will literally go into the garbage. And it's just, I don't know, there's something really sort of lonely about it to me if I'm just sort of being vulnerable and individual about it. But something about that dumpster just catches me unaware every time.
Yeah, it's a haunting mental image. Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm kind of curious, in looking into this type of stuff, are there certain plants that for you kind of jump out as being things that people think about as being associated with death or funeral rites or things like that?
Oh, wow. That's a question with so many answers. I mean, if we're being very Western, very white, very American, very modern, that's easy. We could talk about calla lilies till the end of time. Sick to death of saying calla lilies. I think that's probably the most common, followed by carnations. But you could spread that out over so many sort of micro communities and cultures, and even across history, and it would look very different for each group and each time period. And that is really only talking about things that we choose to give to the dead, gifts from the living to the dead, right? But if we're talking about ways we've used those materials historically to work with death, it starts to look really differently. Like even modern day embalming, the processes that we use rely on materials that are still derived from the plants we were using in ancient Egypt. They're not different. We've just sort of distilled them down into tiny bottles of stuff. And we're still using things like pine resin, for example. It stayed the same from then until today. We're still using it as a primary material in embalming. Early embalming materials, I think, are really fascinating, particularly because there was this sense in ancient Egypt, particularly, that the afterlife is sort of this duplicate of the life you're living now, depending on the situation you got. But if you're an asshole, they just fed you to a crocodile, so it doesn't matter. And then you go to the waiting room of the afterlife, which was the worst thing. But if you go on to the lovely field of reeds, you basically live a duplicate of the life you have now, only everything goes perfectly. It's an idealized version of your current life, which I think is sort of fascinating as far as afterlives go. But at the end of that ideal life, you become part of the deity. You become part of Osiris. But because you are putting a lot of emphasis on preserving the body and the body's state of preservation affecting the afterlife that they're having, it was important that the body not only remained fresh, but was pleasant. So they were using some of the most expensive materials they had, fine spices like cardamom and cinnamon, anise, vanilla was common.
I want to just interject real quick and remind people it's really difficult for us as modern people to kind of contextualize just how valuable these things were.
Oh my gosh.
You know, we can go to the grocery store and, you know, get a bottle of it's actually cassia, but it's labeled cinnamon for like, you know, maybe $4 or $5 or maybe $10, depending on where you shop. But it used to be like worth more than its weight in gold for a long time. So yeah.
Something that I do with myself, and it's a bit of a segue, but whenever I'm having like a really shit day, and we all have those, sometimes I just walk into my kitchen and I stand there for a moment and I consider what it might be like for any of my ancestors to be standing in that nicely air-conditioned, tidily insulated room with this like sad rack of the most expensive things they've ever seen shoved into a corner.
With a magic box in your pocket that can tell you anything you might possibly want to know or listen to any music you might want to hear. Yeah, absolutely.
When you said magic box, I was thinking of the refrigerator.
Oh, well, that one too.
Yeah. Right. I mean, it's just wild to imagine how different our lives are. I'm standing there with vaccines in me. I can't, you know?
Sure. Absolutely.
We live, even those of us who are the most impoverished, likely live better than most kings did for most of history. And yes. I find that to be a very helpful thought to hang on to when I'm having a bad time.
Yeah, context is so important. Absolutely.
Sort of going back to that conversation about embalming, that they were gathering up the finest things they had and making these blends that were, my God, I mean, if I had to put a price on that by today's standards, I mean, I guess I could. If I'd thought of it, I would have mathed it out before this. I didn't know we were going to be talking about this. But we're thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars, easily, just to prepare this person for their entombment or their burial. These were not burials, but we'll call it that.
Do you think there's a parallel in terms of like just the act of like, you know, sacrificing these materials or like spending a lot of money in present times on like a really fancy funeral? Like, is there some kind of a parallel there in terms of like how the grieving process might work for people, do you think?
That's going to be really, really cultural.
Okay, sure.
And I can come back to that question. I did want to make a comment about embalming, because this is something I actually talk about a lot. But if you take all of those items that you might have used to embalm someone, to mummify someone in ancient Egypt. And that's very funny to me because I often start classes, workshops, and presentations that I give by giving a little soapbox speech about intention. It's one of my least favorite expressions in the pagan community as a whole. I just made someone mad. I'm really sorry. Please yell at me on threads about it. I won't see it if you're on Twitter. Yeah, when we talk about intention, but it really doesn't mean anything sort of in terms of the earliest meanings of that word. It's just a course of action you mean to follow. It's not very valuable. I mean, you can have a kid do something to another kid and then them say, well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt your feelings or whatever, but you did, and that was
Mhm.
the impact. Your intention didn't really matter too much. Context is what is important, because if I intend to make scrambled eggs, but the context of that egg is a bowl with, flour and oil and sugar and shit in it, I made a pancake. It doesn't matter what my intention was. And the only difference between making a mummy, embalming a mummy, and making a cup of chai is the room you're standing in and some boiling water, because the ingredients are the same.
Okay.
And that fascinates me. I recently, it's been a couple of years ago, but I recreated one of those ancient recipes and made that blend. And while standing there with all those spices on my counter, I went, oh, and I poured water on it. And now that's what I make my tea out of every day.
Is the pumpkin spice similar to an embalming blend?
It's not dissimilar.
Okay, I kind of love that.
Yeah, there are some differences, but they're pretty semantic, especially considering that early on, the blend you used to mummify, I can't say words, a specific individual would have been very personal and specific to that individual. They might have made changes to any given blend. So yeah, pumpkin spice can totally be embalming spices.
All right, well, you've heard it here first. You can be embalmed in your favorite pumpkin spice for the holiday.
In fact, if you go poke around in the free posts on my Patreon, I've got a recipe up there for making an instant chai blend.
I love it. Fuck yeah.
To your other question, sure, maybe. I do think sometimes people put a lot of money into giving someone reverence that they suddenly realize they no longer have the time to give them. I think that's a big factor.
Mm.
And realistically, in the United States, a funeral is one of the 3 most expensive things a person will ever purchase in their life. And a house is not on that list because most people don't own a house. So bear that in mind. But the other 2 items are a car and a wedding. And I want to be really clear. I think there's this idea that the funeral industry is expensive, and I don't know why, but people picture funeral directors as being these like grifty salesmen trying to get people to spend their money, but that's not really how this works. We have a general price list. They can look at it. They're like federal government mandated standards for pricing, and we can't even like stand there and show them things. We put them in a room with all the goods and they can select, but people will still navigate away from the less expensive items and to the more expensive ones. And that's their choice, totally their choice. But I think on a psychological level, we suddenly feel like this is our last opportunity to do something good for people. And I think that's a little distinct maybe from what was happening in ancient Egypt, because there they had a very specific religious connection to preserving the body, because its state of preservation was directly correlated to its state in the afterlife. Here, we just live busy, crazy lives and maybe don't spend enough time with each other. And we want to do this one last good thing. And I've seen firsthand enough at funerals where families will make comments about how the deceased individual, lived a poor life or didn't have a lot or never did find things for themselves, and they want them to have this one last time. And that's such a common sentiment.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and I guess here, we don't have the same type of relationship with our dead that exists in some other cultures where, we can still hang out with grandma when she passes. Like, that's not something that most people do here in the US and other places like this. So I think that might be part of all of this like discomfort, right? This is something that comes up a lot in these types of conversations, is just our phobias surrounding death, and sometimes the ways that we tend to cope with it seem kind of like awkward because of that.
I think too, it's important to remember that we as a nation at least have a lot of death related trauma. Somebody made a joke to me the other day about how people in the UK think 100 miles is far and people in the United States think 100 years is old. That's a little bit telling about America, especially when you consider that we had the Revolutionary War, followed by the Civil War, followed by World War I, followed by World War II, followed by Vietnam. Like, this goes on, right?
Mm-hmm. For
a very young country, we've had a lot of tragedy. Much of it self-inflicted, but that's a different conversation. We'll skip that one. But when we look historically at how people respond to death, we see a few things, and it is so important, just like that conversation about the value of spices. It's really important to remember that we have a very short idea of what history is. We look at the last couple hundred years and forget that there's been like, millions and millions of years. But what we understand sort of anthropologically is that wherever a culture is particularly death positive, we are particularly sex repressed. And where we are sex positive, we are death repressed. And you can see that ebb and flow over history. If you look back into recent American history and you look at World War II, the world saw a lot of tragedy, a lot of death, and so many people just did not come home to their families. It was basically an entire country mourning their children. And we follow that directly with the Cold War, and we have these ideas about nuclear devastation, and this is what led us down the path of grocery stores and frozen dinners, and it like really affected where we are today as a country, whether we like it or not, or whether we think about it or not. It's a reality. You have canned soup at home because in the 50s someone was afraid there would be a nuclear bomb and we'd all be trapped in our houses for years, and we just don't think about that. But we sort of made this move toward the nuclear family, cis-het family with 1.5 kid. What did they do with the other half of that kid? I always
Right. Yeah. And this is a very sort of like 1950s, like when these kinds of what we consider to be traditional gender roles, even though they're pretty new, were kind of coming into like really hardcore solidity, as far as I understand. I know this stuff is complicated, right?
Very complicated, but we did have such a strong sort of motivation as a nation to sort of buckle down and, make more people, since so many people died. Right. It's messy and awful. We have all this trauma surrounding death. So what do? We see the rise of something else, retirement homes. We put everyone that reminds us of dying somewhere else, so we don't got to look at them. And we become very, very death repressive. So what follows immediately on the heels of all this death repression? The sexual revolution. So we do that for a bit. And right now we're seeing a rise in death positivity, which should really terrify anyone with a uterus because that's a terrible path we're currently on.
Sure, yeah. Well, we've seen some recent things coming out of like the Supreme Court and elsewhere that should give everybody, I think, pause, because the issue is doesn't just affect those with uteruses either. So yeah,
I'm being very quippy. I have no uterus. Mine is in the freezer next to the Haagen-Dazs. That is the truth. That is a fact. I've been joking for a couple years. I'm going to find just the right Republican senator to lob it at one of these days. Regulate it. Put it on your.
Oh, well, make sure to get a video of that.
That would be an excellent time watching me go to prison. Assaulting someone with a biological hazard. Nevertheless.
Yeah. Well, yes, I was thinking about glitter bombing being an alternative. I know this is something that has been experimented with, using glitter in a weaponized fashion.
Yes, I've seen a bit of that. That's fun. I also love things like planting seeds sort of maliciously is super fun, as long as they're appropriate for your region. Don't plant that are non-native. But I love taking wildflower seeds and spreading them about where people don't enjoy those things being.
Yeah, I love that. And also you're creating food for pollinators by doing that. So that's cool.
Absolutely, 100%. You would love my backyard since it's a horrible wreck, and it's for the pollinators.
Native bees are ground nesting and need little piles of sticks and stuff like that. You're just helping the pollinators. Absolutely.
I literally cannot step outside of my office door right now without pausing to let all the butterflies just go away because I have these absolutely horrible Osage orange trees that are just sort of malicious, and they just grow, and I'm unwilling to cut them down. So they'll live forever and drop all this like weird inedible fruit all over the place. But butterflies adore it, and so do the deer. So we tolerate each other's presence.
Okay, well, right on. I mean, there's some plants like that, like loquats here. People are always attacking the loquat trees. They're always like cutting them down, but they're actually really cool. They create a lot of food for pollinators and food for like wildlife, and you can actually use the fruits for like making distilled beverages and jams and stuff like that if you're creative enough. So I don't know what people's problems are with like edible greenery being around, but I wish we had more like useful foliage rather than just ornamental stuff.
We have so much sort of interesting edible wildlife here. And even though it's not all necessarily great for human beings, I don't think I'm the most important thing here. So I'm glad other things can eat them. But
Mhm.
we have just wonderful sumac and the wild, tiny, sour as hell persimmons, which I adore, walnut trees, blackberries that just grow everywhere, just crazy, crazy everywhere. And I actually use them to make some of the candles in my shop. Blackberries magically are very protective. So I combine that with my ancestral connection to them, vis-a-vis my grandmother, to make a candle, which I very much enjoy.
Oh yeah, I love that.
Have you, I'm curious, ever made sumac lemonade since we're talking about plants?
No, I have not. Actually, I'm unaware of this delicacy.
Sumac, if you're familiar, and definitely make sure you know what it is and that it's a safe plant for you to be consuming. But if you find the correct one, you can crush them into sweetened water just like you might lemons and make what tastes like berry lemonade.
Very cool.
They're just these tiny, weird little red berries that look totally unattractive and unappealing, but they make the tastiest beverage.
So, if I'm recalling correctly, sumacs are reputed to have like a lot of like tannins and stuff. Is it the tannins that maybe give it that kind of like bitter, acidic? I'll have to look into this, but yeah, interesting. Very cool.
Maybe. I never hear of people from other parts of the world doing that, and I sometimes wonder if it's like really micro-regional, making sumac lemonade, but
I'm here for it. I love these kinds of like little regional tidbits and dishes and stuff like that. There's such a like a wealth of, I don't know, just nuance there. Very cool.
and that too, that brings that back to Necrobotany, right? I actually pulled up a little snippet from the book to read for you and your viewers, and I think it really connects the thought. But I write, at the end of the day, resurrecting lost skills, lost knowledge, lost arts. That's always necromancy. Turning back the clock and reclaiming those skills and experiences common to our ancestors. I find my grandmother in the garden. My ancestors live on in that instinct to add a dash of salt to a soup pot, or in the touch of a sanding block in my hands as I smooth the surface of a fence, in the clang of a hammer striking an anvil. This is where those who came before are found.
I love that. Very cool.
Foxtrot, 3, Romeo, 2, 2, 4, Yankee, Romeo, 7, Bravo, Delta, Quebec.
Greetings, it is I, Luxa from the future. Thanks so much for listening. I hope that you're enjoying the episode so far. We're going to be getting back to the rest of my awesome chat with Mortellus in just a little while here, including dispelling some myths surrounding necromantic practices, the Catholics and their influence on necromancy, and the origins of the Ouija board's spooky reputation, and much more. I also learned something new about the board game Monopoly, so there's lots of fun stuff to get into here. After the interview, we're going to do listener mail and shoutouts. I'll address an interesting question about chaos magic and what I would probably call accelerationism that somebody asked me on Instagram. And there's also going to be a listener supporter bibliomancy break. But now it's time for the episode within the episode. I spoke with CJ Lane about his new cut-up poetry project, Caught One Glimpse, which will be available soon around the winter solstice. There's a lot of cool elements to the project, which CJ used. The PGM and other texts to create poems, which are also spells. This is something that I'm also very into. The pen is not only mightier than the sword, but the pen is the sword, as I would say. We're going to hear a little bit about Cinnabar the Mage and his journey through the 5 elements, and about the process that CJ used to create Caught One Glimpse. All right, well, without further ado, let's get into it here. Here's my chat with CJ Lane.
Delta, Romeo, Hotel, Whiskey, Romeo, November, Golf, Tango.
All right, well, my guest today is CJ Lane. CJ, how's it going?
Oh, it's going well. How are you doing, Luxa?
I'm doing really well. I'm really excited to hear about this very cool project that you have going on. There's a lot of intersections of my interests that are represented by it, so I think it should be really interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's been an experience, I'll say, getting into cut up poetry. Yeah, I mean, like I told you when I messaged you on Patreon, I definitely like your podcast really helped to introduce me to the concept, or to revisit the concept of cut up poetry, I should say. I was exposed to it a little bit in my undergraduate years, and I experimented it. Just the first couple I did just didn't really click with me. I even did one about a year ago. I got a Trump campaign thing in the mail. I turned that into a cut up poem, so that one was fun. Um, but earlier this year, I really, I think it was February, I was like, I'm going to do a month of cut up poems. I didn't make it to a month, but I think I did like 20 or something. And at that point, for the first time in my career as a writer, as a poet, I really felt like I found my voice through that experimental form.
I love that. That's very cool. Could you speak a little bit more about what that process was like?
Yeah, yeah. So my process, I I can't bear to actually cut up a book. So I have a typewriter. It's a 1950s Smith Corona that's quite a bit of fun to type on, but
Cool.
I type out passages of linear text from various sources. I sometimes use randomness to determine what sources I'll cut up, but I've also, I mean, this is a bit of a side note, but I did use my cat to help me write a poem. I picked 3 volumes, put them on the ground in front of her, and had her put a tree in front of each one of them and had her pick one out. And that was a great experience. My cat's name is Calliope as well, so named
Oh,
after
that's
the muse
perfect.
the
Yes,
muse
that
of
is so
poetry.
perfect. Yeah. Okay. We love that. Yeah, we had a little uh student publication where I went to school called Calling on Calliope once. So it was very cool.
Yeah, it's definitely it felt nice because when I or not nice, but it felt like the culmination of the magic I've been working, right? I named her when I adopted her, I named her that as kind of like a little, a hope that I would have more of that muse and the
Mm.
qualities that Calliope brings, more of that in my art. And so, like I said, involving her in that really did feel like a culmination of my magic, I guess.
I love
uh,
that.
but I digress, and I was trying to explain my method. So I type it out using my typewriter, cut it up, and then I actually made a like collection, almost like a word bank of linear text from I think 20 or so different sources for my experiments back in March. And it was really interesting to see the juxtaposition in the different language. I made there's one poem I made that had some lines from the Beatitudes and some lines from the Star Spangled Banner come up,
Mm.
and I felt like that was I don't know, it's interesting to see the contrast between different concepts as you're mixing and matching text.
Yeah, that is very cool. I love it. So to give listeners some context, what is this project all about?
Oh yeah, so this project is it I I'm very excited for it. So my collection of cut up poems, which I decided to title it by drawing a one of those scraps of linear text I had in my little collection. And I drew Caught One Glimpse, and I was like, okay, that's the title for
Mm.
sure, because it really does speak to what I think poetry, and especially cut up poetry, what they allow us to do, right? It gives
Mm.
us a chance to catch a glimpse at something deeper. Kind of, I think I'm very influenced by the surrealists as well. And I think that what we can see through cut up poems is very similar to the goals of the surrealists in terms of, I think they articulate it as like interacting with the collective unconscious. That's not
Mm.
exactly what I would term it, but I think it's, accessing a very similar place.
Yeah, this idea of kind of being a sort of bridge between the world of the dream and the world of reality and bringing more of like the dream into the world or things like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, and especially the exploration of liminal spaces.
Mm.
That so this collection is ultimately the story of a liminal space. So I've set it up. It's a bit of a hyper sigil because I, there's some things I hope it ultimately leads to, but it follows the path of kind of like the fictionalized version of myself, which is in Cinnabar the Mage, which I kind of stole from Cyprian, Saint Cyprian, and the Testament of Cyprian. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I digress. Yeah. So that's definitely interesting to think of yourself in a different way, and really just be able to write about an aspect of yourself because yeah, so that's one portion of it, but it follows his journey upwards through the five elements in a, I don't know, it's a very idiosyncratic thing that I've got going. But I ultimately see it as an allegory and a metaphor for the way in which working with our spirituality, working with our magic, working with whatever paradigms you work with, I think see as an allegory for the way in which that can bring about wholeness, whatever that means to people individually.
Yeah, I love that. Very cool.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And like I said, I'm very excited for it. It's I am entering just the very final stages of editing it. So it's really all just starting to feel like it's coming together. And
Yeah.
it very excited because so last year I self-published a chapbook of I think it was 21 poems, and that was a very interesting, cool experience. But now what I'm working on just feels so much grander because it is a narrative, whereas my chapbook didn't really have that narrative to it. And ultimately, it's kind of the narrative of self-discovery.
I love that. Yeah, it sounds like a sort of like internal hero's journey of some type, and yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah, it definitely is, and it's given me, like I said, gave me an opportunity to interact more deeply with a part of myself.
Yeah, I love that. I've definitely experimented with this through writing as well and written some stuff under different names and kind of explored these different aspects of things. And yeah, very cool. So if I recall correctly, you have been working a little bit with the Greek Magical Papyri as part of this?
Yeah, yeah. So I have been, and with those experiments too, I wanted to create something that was both a poem but also a spell at the same time.
Mhm.
So I've been working on, like I said, some cut up poems from the Greek Magical Papyri, and those are going to form. So the layout of the collection, the very beginning is going to be the Grimoire of Cinnabar the Mage as a way of establishing, not to be too technical with the poetry terms, but a way of establishing that verisimilitude and really giving a sense of him as a character. But for those who pick up on the fact that these are actually spells, I hope, I don't know, I'm curious to see, like you say all the time, fuck around and find out, right? I'm
Got
very
it.
curious to see where it goes. And I haven't really put any of those into practice yet in terms of experimenting with them magically, but I when I read the Greek Magical Papyri, I see it as I don't know, it's hard to describe, but it feels like a very powerful text to me in a way that very few texts I've interacted with feel.
Well, itself is a sort of like, in a way, maybe not a cut up, but like it's a, a collection of a bunch of different
Mhm.
things. So it has this kind of like collage nature to it, which I do think gives it a lot of power.
Yeah, yeah, I that's a very great way of articulating that, and it's very interesting to see. One thing I found through cut up poems is you get this very intimate sense of the language that the writer is using and where they're coming from. Uh, it's language. This is a bit of a digression, but I find so much power in language as a whole. When I was first starting as a writer, I read Stephen King's On Writing, and in that book, he compares writing to telepathy, because you, through the little squiggles you put on the page, put a very exact image in another person's head. And there are going to be some differences to what the other person sees in their mind's eye, but ultimately, I can't think of anything more magical than being able to make these abstract signs, which are kind of like sigils, and then communicate such a depth of abstract meaning. It's grown more and more impressive to me the more and more I've taken linguistics courses and learned about the history of language more generally. It is a very interesting story, to say the least, and that really reflects, I think, in the Greek Magical Papyri, that their language is specific. Like I know we had talked about on Patreon, but they you can learn a lot about the culture of Hellenic Egypt through those texts. We can see, like I had said, there's a very obvious lack of regard for consent in those texts, especially within the love spells. And I think that that really just speaks to the attitudes of the people writing it, their attitudes towards consent and towards other people.
Sure, yeah. For people that don't have context, there's a lot of spells in there which are kind of like labeled as love spells, which are what people would consider like pharmakeia, like spells which include ingredients that might have like a properties of like a drug or other thing like that. So a lot of them are sort of like literally slipping somebody a Mickey in a way, and it's like, yeah, it's kind of gross to the modern perspective for sure, and maybe to the perspective of the day too. I don't know how the general society felt about these things in their time either. It's possible they were looked on with aspersion as well back then. I'm not sure.
Oh, definitely possible. I know some of the love spells cause the other person to be unable to sleep until they're in love with you,
or to leave your house.
Yes,
or like...
it is like you said, from modern eyes, it's reprehensible.
It's like yeah, a lot of yikes and raised eyebrows and like, oh man. Yeah.
I mean, likewise with the animal sacrifice
Sure.
that you find in the text. I personally, that's something that I I find myself kind of guided to an extent by Buddhist ethics. I know it's kind of out of left field when brought into Greek Magical Papyri, and so for me, the idea of killing another being to do my magic, even if it is an animal, just like I said, same thing with the lack of consent within the text. It definitely doesn't work with my own practice, and I think that raises one of the difficulties with working with historical paradigms is how do we take modern ethics and apply that to something that is from an entirely different historical context.
Sure, absolutely. And I think it gets really complicated with the issue of like animal sacrifice too, because there's so many different like ways that these things played out and everything. And like in some cases, it was about like, it was a sort of like ritualized way to slaughter an animal that was going to be consumed anyway. But then in other cases, it's very much not the case, and it was about something else, right? And so it's like, as a modern person, like if I'm a meat eater, like how do I bring some of that ritual into like that sacrifice or that this animal has made or whatever too. Like there's a lot of interesting perspectives here.
100%. And it also offers a great opportunity, especially to us chaos magicians, right? Where we can take what they wrote in the Greek Magical Papyri and change it in some ways and see if it still works. And I've had good experience with that, especially the headless rite. I've worked with that more than a few times and have had some truly intense experiences.
Yeah, it is popular for a reason, everybody, for sure.
Oh yeah, God, this was probably a year and a half ago. I was doing it alone in my bedroom. I was doing the headless rite, and there's a line about thunder or lightning. I can't think of it off the top of my head. And right when I said the line, a storm started. outside,
no
and
one.
and I was just like,
No
wow,
one-
that's
nice.
yeah, it was one of those moments where I was like, oh, this works. I don't know what's happening exactly, but it definitely has a result.
Sure. Yeah, there's a lot going on with it too. The idea of the resonance of the barbarous words in it is something that I played with a lot in terms of like finding that right tonality that like really hit for me and stuff like that. Yeah, there's a lot of there.
Oh yeah, and it since you mentioned barbarous words, I see that as, kind of the future of this project I'm working on, working with cut up poems, is seeing what I can do with the barbarous words in terms of rearranging them in cut ups, but still have it um, work, but also still represent what it, to an extent, like the deities they represented historically and other concepts that they represented, really just making sure to, I don't know, not get too far away from the source material, but also, again, making something that works for my own personal paradigm.
I'm curious if, as a linguist, there's anything that jumps out at you about barbarous words that you've seen in any of these texts. Is there anything you want to like comment there, just because you have so much background in it?
Yeah, I find what I find most interesting is the use of Hebrew words in non-Hebrew spells.
Hmm.
So for those who don't know, the Greek Magical Papyri, a lot of the texts have a mix of Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew slash maybe early Christian symbolism and deities within it. And so seeing like I never pronounce it right, but IAO, I believe is a is oh no, it's a moon deity. Sorry, this is there are some I apologize, but yeah, there are definitely some parts where you do see some of the hidden names of Yahweh
Mhm.
appearing within spells that aren't within that paradigm. And I think it's very interesting the way in which used they saw power in these words, regardless of what they represented, if that makes sense. And so they
Yeah.
employed it in places where, to us as a modern reader, we're like, well, Yahweh, the Jewish God, he's pretty clear about being the only God. So why are people employing his name in a spell that has nothing to do with him?
It's yeah, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance there, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yes, yes. And so that to me is the most interesting thing, because I think it speaks to the way in which language is representative of culture, and Egypt at this point in history, which is around, I never remember when they were written, but around the year zero. Again, there are a lot of different texts, so there are different years, I believe, but it is, really representative of Egypt being a melting pot of ideas at this point in time, especially Alexandria.
yeah, that makes sense. I'm thinking of the Library of Alexandria, this kind of like real center for scholarship.
Yeah, and we don't, as modern people, I don't think we realize just how multicultural Egypt was during this period in history. And we see, I've heard that there were Buddhist monks in Alexandria, in Egypt during this time. And it wasn't a common thing, but you see all of these different systems of thought coexisting, and the magicians of the time pulled from each of the different systems of thought in order
Mhm.
to empower their spells. I think that's very interesting, again, from a chaos magic perspective, how they were able to take these dissonant things and turn them into something that worked.
Yeah, absolutely. And also when we look at religious syncretism, I think there's a lot of interesting things there, especially like getting into it historically, how it unfolded, like maybe with the Roman Empire and stuff. Like there's a lot of interesting little tidbits I think we can extract from looking at these histories for sure.
Yeah, and I also think that we haven't really, I think we don't acknowledge the role, or not we, making sweeping statements here, but I think that the magic of the Greek magical papyri persisted in some ways through Western magic.
Mhm.
I borrowed a little bit of that idea, I believe, from Dr. Stephen Skinner. I read earlier this year, I read The Techniques of Greco-Egyptian Magic, and I
Okay.
found that to be very informative. And we see, or he believes that the magic of the Goetia is, especially the earlier stuff, I believe the Hygromantia. I'm definitely not an expert on the Goetia, but he sees that as an extension in some ways of the techniques found in the Greek magical papyri.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I was gonna mention too, you had brought up the like secret names of God, and there's like a whole grimoire that's
Mm-hmm.
these sort of barbarous words. It's called the Magic of the Sword, or I think it's called the Sword of Moses. There's a translation of it, which is the Magic of the Sword of Moses, which I'd love to talk with the author about. But yeah, the sword is essentially these barbarous words that are these secret names, and in different combinations they do different things. So it's kind of yeah, it's very interesting, just completely all name magic.
Yeah, it is so interesting, and I believe I've read, this could just be me conjecturing, but I believe I've read that the different associations between some of the secret names of God represent the time before the Hebrews were monotheistic,
Mm.
because they combined the elements of their different deities into their one God. Again, I could be off base on that. I feel like I read that somewhere, but that's never a guarantee.
Yeah, that I mean that kind of makes sense. Like we can see in other religions how like there are these different deities, but they're sometimes viewed as like being sourced from like one primal source and they're just different aspects of it. You know, there I think that that kind of tracks for me at least like in terms of that would make sense.
Yeah, and it now that you articulated that way, I think that's close to what I think, in terms of my own philosophical mindset. I don't think we can ever understand whatever the whatever the power of the universe is. I don't think we can ever fully understand it, but I think we can understand aspects of it, which is what um which is what I seek to do through my poetry. Is I think by breaking down again through the lens of cut ups and other surrealist methods, breaking down our normal system of thought into a more dreamlike sensibility that we can then approach these different aspects of reality with, which ultimately I think those aspects of reality are what people refer to as the divine.
Yeah. I would tend to agree with that, and the idea that the kind of, as far as we can tell, it looks like the sort of like nature of the world in which we live is very like fractal and iterative
Mhm.
and stuff. And so like the idea of it just being sort of turtles all the way down and all the way up also makes sense to me if that makes sense.
Yes, no, and I think it's one of those things too where ultimately the truth about our reality is ineffable. We
Mm.
can't really grasp it. I don't think, at least from the experiences I've had, both magically and the few times I've done psychedelics. I see reality as, like you said, fractal is a great way to describe it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm thinking now about this idea of like paradigms or reality tunnels. Another word for it is umvelts. Like this idea that there's a certain kind of sphere of awareness that each of us has based on our biology, like what our sense data give us, our history, all kinds of other things, right? And like to assume that there would be a sort of like meta view of all of these things together, this like I think it's called an Uber Umwelt. We know you'd have to sort of assume that like the only thing that would be able to like have that big perspective would be this like sort of divine intelligence, right? And so like
Mhm.
is it just the combination of everybody's story together, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, and like I said, I think there's good arguments for many of the different perspectives on it. And ultimately, through experiencing these different perspectives, I think we come to a better sense of our own reality, like you said, reality tunnel or paradigm. Like, I think that's what's important, is to come to our own sense of self, which is, or yeah, own sense of self, our own magic. I think these things are very idiosyncratic.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think about this stuff too, I think about the idea of like wanting to have this, reality tunnel be broader. Like what other experiences, like what can I gain from like learning from the experiences of other people who have had things in their life that I would never be able to experience, right? Like this idea of like empathy being a way that that can be broadened, is attractive to me too.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I've very much noticed that what you're talking about, the broadening of my reality tunnel. As I've gotten my degree, as I've learned about linguistics, I've broadened my perspective on language as a whole, and it's changed the way I view the world. I, I always say there's a difference between believing something and knowing something to be true.
Mhm.
And I finally find myself believing that there is a greater power in language itself, that there's something, like I said earlier, truly magical about it. I think there's a reason we find what Gematria, Kabbalah, there's a reason people looked in the past, especially to letters and words as signs of power,
Mhm.
especially when literacy rates were low.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea of information being a type of social power is definitely talked about in a lot of different contexts too, and I think that that's a kind of a good touchstone for it. Can you read, or are you not able to?
Yeah, and for much of human history, that was a way to separate the lower classes from the upper classes, like Egypt, where we find priests and scribes being able to read and write, but not the common people. And
Sure.
I see that very similar to how I see the relationship between a Catholic priest and God,
I
where
was just
they
going to
are.
bring that up.
I'm glad, because it is this monopolization of an incredibly important part of life.
hmm Yeah, and this idea that, and I'm going to get us into the weeds real quick, but I promise I'll be able to reel us back, hopefully. The idea that like this, there's this sort of like, as you said, this monopoly, try that again, this monopolization on this like sort of contact with the higher power. And this is done through, doing masses in Latin in the case of Catholicism, right? Like making it so that it's difficult to access for the, common layperson that doesn't speak Latin. And so they have to kind of be willing to trust that like they're go-between, they have to so it gives a lot of like power for that sort of gatekeeping of this religious idea. And I think that we're starting, and I think this is a very sort of like normal thing for like governments or other like power structures to want to do, and for it to like manifest a lot of different ways. I think in history there was a lot of times where we would see the state and the like, religion of the state being sort of hand in glove and very closely related to each other. I just read this book called Imminent by Lou Elizondo, which is about the disclosure thing and the UAPs, or which is what people are calling UFOs now, which is a topic I'm like deeply interested in, but not because of the whole question about whether or not there's extraterrestrials or whatever, but because of as like a sort of modern anthropology study about watching this unfold in this sort of like cultural level. And it's interesting to hear the arguments being made about like, oh, well, we have this contact with this higher intelligence and only these special people in the government can do it. And like, so I think that there's an interesting sort of like element of what we're seeing of that starting to emerge within our own state. For some people, for some camps, it's very complicated. There's a lot of different camps and stuff, but um, kind of coming back to that idea of language, like Lou Elizondo actually talks about this in his book in relationship with his experiences as a remote viewer. And he is of the opinion that we were all able to sort of like do this very what's the right word here? Efficient telepathic communication with one another to almost like see through each other's eyes if we wanted to and things like that. And he thinks that it was learning language that took this ability away from us, that we sort of made this, bargain that, just like with Prometheus giving us fire, like it comes with strings attached. Like it's not necessarily going to be good for humans in the myth, but like Prometheus is just doing what Prometheus does, right? So, yeah, I thought that was kind of an interesting tie in there with like the idea of language and telepathy, and it reminded me of what she said earlier about magic being one of our, or sorry, language being one of our first types of magic. And I do think that magic is a type of technology too.
It definitely is. As my perspectives on magic have broadened, I've started to see it more and more in my everyday life. So I'm a bread baker professionally,
Rad.
and the more and more I learned about bread, I know it's a bit of a tangent,
No, I
but
used to bake bread every day. I love it.
but I came to see that bread baking at its most fundamental level, if you don't understand the science behind it, is indistinguishable from magic.
Mhm.
If you combine water, flour, and salt, eventually, or actually, I guess water and flour at first to make a sour culture, wait a few days, and then make a loaf of bread, including salt, you can make bread from basically nothing.
Mhm.
And that there's something truly special about it, especially the chemistry behind it, because gluten and all the other things at play, it's like this very perfect recipe in order for us to make bread. And it was naturally occurring in the wheat. And I just find that so interesting that we were able to take this natural product and eventually, through, modification, yield this wheat that gives us so much gluten that we can make these lovely loaves of bread. I don't know. It's
Yeah.
just,
Don't
it,
forget
it
our friend the fungi.
oh yes, of course, of course.
And
But
and beer is like this too, I think. Another
yes,
example. Yeah.
yeah, and I've heard it theorized that beer is a big part of what led to the creation of civilization, or not necessarily civilization, but settled society would be the better way to express it.
I've heard some arguments along these lines as well. I've read a book about the history of beer that took this perspective. I've heard people argue against it as well, of course, as historians are wont to do. But like, I do think there's something interesting there. Obviously, like for storing, for just sanitation purposes, because you have to get it hot in order to like make the beer. That would have, I feel like, done a lot.
Yeah, yeah, oh yeah, that is I think the main reason why beer was safe to drink when the water wasn't in many
Yeah,
places.
sure. And that's people still say sometimes if you're going to a place where you're not maybe not like adapted to the local flora and fauna and stuff, that a light beer might treat you better than a water might. So, well, very cool. So
Yeah.
where can people find Caught a Glimpse? Is that right?
Yeah, caught one glimpse.
Caught
Sorry.
one glimpse.
Yeah, it will be available on Amazon. Hopefully, I might release it a little bit earlier, but by the winter solstice.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I like to do my book releases on the equinox or the solstice, depending on what I'm going for with the overall vibe of the
I
book.
love it. Oh yeah, okay. Very cool.
And then my first chapbook, Sacred and Profane, is available on Amazon as both a Kindle and a print copy. I do all of my own self-publication. There's something nice about owning my own copyrights.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, and I also host a podcast about all things Wisconsin. It's called Brutal Wisconsin. We don't really touch on too much occult topics. We talk about Mothman a lot because there have been a lot of sightings. I'm speaking of UFOs like you did earlier. There have been a lot of sightings of Mothman in the Wisconsin and Great Lakes region. And it's just truly such a weird phenomena that I can't not talk about it.
Yeah, that is fascinating. Well, everybody has an unhealthy interest in Mothman since we've seen that beautiful sculpture and his
Oh yeah.
perfectly sculpted butt. So I want to hear a little bit more about these Mothman sightings.
Yeah, so it started, I think, in 2017 or 2018. It's mostly in the Chicago area, especially around O'Hare Airport.
Hmm.
And a lot of the sightings, unfortunately, I think are cranes or other large birds because they do populate this region and they're easily mistaken, but there are just some truly strange things people report. Like someone reported what looked like a man with, I think, a jetpack floating in midair in downtown Chicago. It gets really strange.
Yeah, there have been some reports of that. This was, yeah, a couple years ago. I remember hearing multiple reports of somebody with a jetpack flying around. I think it was either New York or Chicago, a major city.
Yeah, it is it like when my co-host and I talk about it, we do take like a very skeptical approach. But there are
Probably
some,
wise.
yeah. But there are some of the stories that we encounter where I just have to say, like, it something weird happened to these people. I don't know what exactly,
Sure.
but us magic practitioners know that there's a lot of weird stuff out in the world. And
Yes.
having experienced some of it myself, I'm like, yeah, I think some of these reports have some merit to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think there's, yeah, I would never say that I don't think that there's strange things happening in the world or that people aren't seeing and having strange experiences and things like that. That's obviously the case, but some of the narratives that surround it are very questionable too. So, yeah.
Exactly. There was one, my favorite Mothman story. It was actually reported from right by where I lived at the time. And the people said they were driving out in the country in circles, which means they were smoking weed. And they said they saw Mothman by a nature preserve. And I was like, okay, I live 5 minutes from this place. I go and I'm walking around, and while I'm walking around, a crane flies out of the like bushes and into the air. And I'm like, okay, that's I think probably what they saw. But I mean, if for those who have not seen birds of that size, you wouldn't think that they're as big as they are. It's kind of intimidating, honestly.
And it's interesting. It says something kind of interesting about cognition too, for me here, just in terms of like, it's interesting that it's Mothman is more recognizable than an actual real world bird to some folks, right? Like that is what this
Yeah.
suggests, right? Like, so
Yeah.
that's very interesting.
I think that says a lot about our society, honestly.
It does too. I'm not sure what, but it says a lot about it says something.
But yeah, definitely love a good Mothman story.
Me too. Send me pictures of Mothman's butt.
When we first talked about Mothman on the show, I made a bit out of saying that I wanted to be his friend. I was like, Mothman, find me. I will be your friend.
Very cool. So where can people listen to Brutal Wisconsin?
Yeah, Brutal Wisconsin's available on Spotify, iTunes, I think pretty much wherever podcasts are found, except for YouTube.
Okay, yeah, right on. Very
Yeah.
cool. Now, thank you so much for hanging out and talking. This has been really fun and really interesting. Are there any questions that you would like to ask me, or do you have any like anything else that you would like to plug if you're excited about it?
Well, I get the one question I thought of was, what's your favorite poem? I think that says a lot about a person.
Oh man, this is difficult because it's going to depend on the day. Because which aspect of my personality is coming most
That's
to the
a good
forefront.
point.
But I've always had a real fondness for Fern Hill by Dylan Thomas.
Oh, I love Dylan Thomas.
Yeah, there's something so beautiful about that line, like, though I was young and easy in the mercy of his means, time held me green and dying, though I ch sung in my chains like the sea. Like that's always like sat with me as like um well, about like the agency, the freedom and also the lack of agency of childhood, but then that kind of carrying over into like other places, like how can you sing in your chains like the sea, or I don't know. So yeah, it's that's one that I like a lot. 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird by Wallace Stevens is another one that's very high on my list.
Definitely. Like I said, I love Dylan Thomas, and 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird is another favorite of mine.
Really? Okay. Fuck yeah.
But if I had to settle on one, it would have to be The Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
Okay, yeah, right on. Good
Yeah,
choice.
that one stuck with me for many years.
Very cool. Well, is there a poem from Caught a Glimpse that you would like to share, or from the first book that you would like to share with the listeners?
Yeah, I actually have a copy of my first book on hand. So let's
Okay.
see. Um, yeah, so the very first poem of the chapbook, and this is the first serious poem that I wrote. I got my undergraduate in creative writing, but with a focus on fiction. And like 4 or 5 years ago, I finally decided that poetry was actually what I was going to pursue. And this was the first poem following that moment of my life. And I wrote and rewrote 200 times, but it is called Nataraja, and it is about a incarnation of Shiva as the Lord of the Dance.
Yeah.
Yeah, so here goes. I am Lord of the Dance, King of Revelers, and Emperor of Euphorics. But sadly, all things must end, and this mask must be discarded, like the myriad before. Now I wear a new identity. I am become death, destroyer of worlds. What was fertile now is fallow. Under my fiery gaze, cities burn. Wind will carry ashes like winter's first snow. In due course, whipping whirlwinds will blow our ashes to the four corners, as we too are subject to samsara. So tonight, love, shed a tear if you must.
Thank you. Fuck yeah, I
Yeah.
love it.
Yeah, and like I said, that was one of the first serious poems I wrote, and it continues to speak to me. It's probably always going to be my favorite.
Well, sometimes what we love first, we love best, so that makes sense.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, this has been so much fun. I really appreciate it, dude. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for being a Patreon supporter and for sharing this really cool project with the listeners, and I am really excited to check it out when it's available.
Yeah, of course. And if anyone wants to check out my other work, I post a lot to Instagram at CJ Lane Poetry, so you can find me there.
Awesome. And I will put links in the show notes to find all that stuff. Well, CJ, do you have any last thoughts or words of advice for the listeners and I?
Yeah, I mean, my biggest words of advice would be to anyone who's a writer and or a poet, but that is, it doesn't matter what the first draft of something is like. Revisit it, because you started with a blank page, and the first step to having a good final draft is to have a not so good first draft. And that took me years to learn that as a writer. Once I did it, it really changed my approach to my process.
Thank you. Yeah, fuck yeah. That's really good and meaningful advice. And I'm still kind of trying to take that lesson home myself. So thank you. Very helpful.
It takes a lot of practice. It took I think only a few months ago it really finally started to click for me.
I love Adventure Time, and there's this saying on it. It's like sucking at something is the first step to being sort of good at something. So.
Yes. I tell my coworkers when they're struggling learning something for a first time, I always say the key to success is being not so good at first. You have to grow. We all start from a blank slate in certain tasks, and it's a work of magic, honestly, to learn and to grow in that regard.
Fuck yeah. I think we should leave it there. That's beautiful.
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right.
Wonderful.
All right, thanks so much to CJ Lane for joining me. It was so cool hearing about his process and all of the rest of it. Fuck yeah. Check out the show notes to find links to CJ Lane's stuff, as well as to the Brutal Wisconsin podcast. All right, I'm very stoked to share the rest of my conversation with Mortellus soon. We're going to get into the Catholics and necromancy, ways to start on your necromantic journey, as well as some fun historical tidbits about the Ouija board, the game Monopoly, and graham crackers. Fun stuff. But first, let me tell you what we have going on with the Green Mushroom Project and Void House, our newest adventure in creating a consent-forward magical space. Green Mushroom Project is an ongoing group magical working I designed in the summer of 2020 and that some friends and I conducted the initiation ceremony for on Halloween of that year. The 4 objectives of the project are to create a network of green or Venus aspected magic for practitioners to draw upon for creative healing and restorative works, The word hypho actually means web, and the sigil we used was inspired by the linking sigil created by the DKMU. It's its own type of linking sigil, I suppose, a webbing sigil, if you will. Second objective was to build and strengthen community and empower individuals within it. Third, to strengthen our position against hate groups and other bullshit through solidarity. And fourth, to encourage individuals to use powerful tech to become more agentic, things like hypersigils and other stuff like that. Working with the biological metaphor of the ecological relationship that some fungi share with some plants, here we're talking about vascular, arbuscular mycorrhizae. If we, the magical practitioners of Green Mushroom Project, are like a forest of trees, the mushroom current connects us and strengthens us like the mycelia in unseen ways. So in addition to this mycelial web, which connects us, there's also the mushroom spores, which are little packets of the current's energy, which can be applied to situations as needed by any practitioner. You can think of them as kind of like micro-servitors. If you want to brush up on what some of those terms mean, you can check out the first episode of this show, Explaining Chaos Magic to My Brother. There's a couple follow-up episodes that you might find useful as well, in which I explained other chaos magic stuff to my brother. Green Mushroom's newest experiment, Void House, we are investigating the healing and alchemical properties of consent, providing consent education to magically inclined people, and organizing a consent-forward magical space for group work both in person and online. There's lots of fun and free activities available to partake in on the Green Machine Discord server, home of the Green Mushroom Sigil Project and Void House. Join us for our weekly Fungal Friday chats about a variety of magical topics, as well as special events like ceremonies and seasonal celebrations. We also have a monthly rune study group and a book club in which we are languorously and luxuriously discussing the book 6 Ways by Aidan Wachter, which is a great primer for magic if you're new to the topic. I'm also leading a book club, which is a different book club, every third Wednesday evening. This is going to be a temporary thing, but we're going to be reading a couple books. We're about halfway through the Illuminatus trilogy by Robert Shea and Robert Anton Wilson right now. And after that's done, we're going to be visiting The Gate to Women's Country by Sherry Tepper. The Green Machine Discord is also a great place to come ask questions or pose philosophical inquiries. We have a lot of smart people there that are into sharing what has and has not worked for them. And in addition to learning stuff about magic and occultism, there are several opportunities for learning about consent and how this applies to magic, spirituality, the will, other topics like that. And this can help us maintain agency, enjoy better relationships, and move more safely and have a generally chiller time in the world. So we're very excited to be announcing a call for submissions for our third offering of collected work. We made a zine back in 2022, and in 2023 we created a digital mixtape with our friends over at We the Hollowed. Now we are compiling recipes for potions, energetic oils, incense, magical foods, and more. Recipes can be more abstract as well, like a recipe for an experience. Go ahead and check the show notes for a link to the submission guidelines. We're collecting those until December 7th, though we may decide to extend that. We'll see how it goes here. Thanks so much to Lavender Laura for spearheading this effort. The idea of consent being a central guiding philosophical principle to doing group magical work, as well as providing education about the nuances of consent to magically inclined people, is something I feel incredibly grateful to have the opportunity to be working on. I've said this before, but I'll probably say it again. In a world that wants to push us around and cause us to conform to the wishes of others, maintaining healthy boundaries, understanding what those boundaries are within yourself, communicating about your needs, and the rest of what can go into a good consent practice is a genuine form of resistance. Thank you so much to everybody who's been assisting with our efforts and who has been showing so much enthusiasm for this way of doing things. Gratitude. As always, much love and much love to everybody participating in the Green Mushroom Project, regardless of what that looks like for you in your practice. You can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com or get me on Instagram at luxoccultpod, or you can find me on Blue Sky at luxestrada919. Go ahead and hit me up for a link to that Discord server. I'd be happy to get you one. Thank you so much to everybody who's been making this show possible by giving on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. It would not be possible without all of you, so I wanted to extend my gratitude once more. And now, without further ado, let's get back into the rest of that rad chat that I had with the very smart and very cool Mortellus. And after the interview, we're going to do listener mail and shoutouts. I'll get into kind of a lengthy answer that I wrote to somebody's question on Instagram and share a couple of final thoughts about how all of this relates to my personal magical practice. And I will also remind you to resist by sharing the Green Mushroom Project Statement of Resistance. All right, fuck yeah, lots of awesome stuff to get into here. Here's the rest of my chat with Mortellus.
Delta, Victor, Mike, November, Delta, Romeo, Hotel, Whiskey, Romeo, November, Golf, Tango.
I think carrying on those traditions and sort of carrying forward the knowledge that all those people who came before us so faithfully carried into each generation so that they could live and prosper and be safe. I do think there's just a ton of magical value in that. And if we look at our recent ancestors, gardening was going to be one of the most important things to them. It really isn't until, the 1950s and our scary death trauma that people stopped gardening. I mean, I don't know why we're all grass farmers now, but that's objectively the weirdest thing to do with your yard, is to like have grass and mow it every week. Mm-hmm. Growing, edible things or letting the world be wild, I think is just really powerful. Mm-hmm. It's deeply rebellious in a world that wants everything to be sort of manufactured and industrialized to let something be wild.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree about the strangeness of grass cultivation. I've always wondered about that, and even especially in climates where Kentucky bluegrass is not supposed to be, and yeah, it's always been very confusing.
I actually know the origin of that. I know where this comes from. We see it with it comes from the wealthy, of course, and having a big lawn with just grass that's perfectly manicured was a symbol of wealth. It was basically saying, I am wealthy enough that I do not have to use my land to grow food.
Okay.
So we're like cosplaying 1700s rich people by having grass lawns.
Okay, so the Lord would have like grass around their manor, and then all the peasant farmers would have to like farm all the other land and grow food or whatever.
Exactly. And also like hand mow that guy's grass.
Sure. Okay. Of course. Yeah. And do everything else. Okay. Well, yeah, that all makes sense. And yeah, that tracks a lot in terms of so many different aspects of what we do culturally, even coming down to like fashion trends and stuff, which has a fascinating history itself too, in terms of like how we choose to like emulate each other and all of the rest of it. I'm curious, in your work, doing necromancy, especially as a mortician, have there been like some major sort of like myths that have come up regarding what that looks like that you would want to like dispel for people who are unfamiliar?
Oh gosh, so many. I think I think starting right off the hip, when people hear the word necromancy, they probably had a very, very specific thought. And that's bad. That's really terrible. Because necromancy historically is a word that has been used to really just describe any work, magical or mundane, that deals with death, the dead, or the dying. It's so broad as to be indefinable if you look back across texts, specifically European texts. We'll stay there because every culture has something that looks like necromancy. But the reason that we have those ideas comes from every other messy thing. It comes from Catholics. If we look at very, very early Catholicism, their way of interacting with the dead was generally distasteful to most cultures. I mean, just look at the process of canonizing a saint. It's basically a recipe for making an angry ghost. Like, how can we disrespect this dead person the most and, make them a saint, and they'll have to do stuff for us. And then we'll like bury their statue outside, upside down, and piss on them and take away their tiny figurine of Jesus if they don't do the stuff we want. Like, that's weird, right?
Yeah, it's really couched in this sort of like coercion type of like, yeah, it's an interesting approach.
It's weirdly hostile, right? And then on top of that, we're like bedazzling corpses, sticking them into the sanctuary or whatever, relics. That's really
making
odd.
Like whole rooms out of them. Like, I mean, some of those ossuaries are like super metal and cool, and like I would love to visit it, but it's also like, this is kind of a weird and creepy thing to do with a bunch of bones. Everybody, like,
I know the bones of my enemies are now my walls. What's up with that? Although objectively very, very funny that they have Galileo's middle finger on display in a cathedral. I think that's a great kind of irony.
That is very fun. I had not heard that before.
Oh yes, that's very Googleable for everyone listening. Very, very Googleable. Nevertheless, they're doing their stuff with death as a brand new religion, sort of trickling off the other end of monolatry and Neoplatonism and whatever. I could go on a whole rant about how if I could time travel, I'd go back and punch Plato. I don't think we can change the past, but I could break Plato's nose. So that is a thing that I can do. Nevertheless, Plato is why we have Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey. So So fresh off of Neoplatonism, we have these early Catholics doing super weird stuff with the dead. Everybody else is like, I don't know how to feel about that. So what do? They have to rebrand everybody else's thing as fucked up. So many of the Grimoire that we refer to, and like pick the stodgiest, most uptight occultist you can think of. They're going to reference a bunch of shit from like the 15th, 16th century, and 90% of it will be written by Pope so-and-so, Pope Honorarius, etc. Mm-hmm. Why on earth would we look at any of that as being like a real good picture of what pagan people ought to be doing, right? Perhaps, just maybe there was some bias in there, is all I'm saying.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I've thought about this myself. I think that part of, and I can't speak for everybody, but I think some of what I've seen in terms of like looking to some of these types of sources has to do with like wanting to have the sureness of whatever like authority is enshrined within them.
Yes.
And where it's I feel like as magicians, we should really be cultivating that authority for ourselves. But that's just my own approach. People should obviously do as they please. But yeah.
100%. And I could like yada, yada, yada my way through a ramble about how we could find useful things in everything. I tell people frequently,
read all the books. Yes.
Read everything. And you're going to find bad stuff in great books by great people. And you're going to find great stuff in bad books by bad people. Just read all the things. That's what's important, right? Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, if we look at these early grimoire, let's talk specifically about how they address magic surrounding the dead. It is, at best, cartoonish. Mm-hmm. There is one spell that I'm very, very fond of because it sounds absurd, and I don't know why anybody takes anything in that book seriously, but to summon a person from the dead to ask them a question, it suggests that you go to a cemetery. Actually, let me retract that. A graveyard. A graveyard's attached to a church. A cemetery is not. So you go to a graveyard, presumably, on Christmas Eve. That will be evident later. And you find the burial place of the person you would like to question. You dig them up. You take their leg bones. Okay. You walk backwards for 5,282, I think. Don't quote me on that. 5,000.
A mile's worth of feet? Okay.
Yeah, 5,000 whatever feet backwards. That's how many steps backwards you have to take. And your last step has to take you through the doors of a church during Mass on Christmas Eve. I see the Christmas, it comes back up. So it has to be during Christ's Mass on the eve of Christ's birth or whatever. Now, this all sounds like a lot of very, very sort of blasphemous, heretical stuff, right? Like it's meant to sound terrible. Mm-hmm. The next bits are the parts that I find very funny because after backtracking your way through the front door on Christmas Eve, where I assume some tiny person is squeaking their way through Ave Maria or something, you are to lob the leg bones into the room and then leave. Doing exactly the same amount of steps backwards. I hope you practice this, otherwise it will go very poorly. Ending at the grave, you were to cross your arms over your chest and fall backward into the hole you just dug. I presume killing yourself on coffin shards. Once you have done so, then the dead will speak to you. And I just think there are better ways to do necromancy.
The dead will speak to you because you'll be dead? Is that what's happening?
I think that might be the punchline. And I also assume everyone from the church is chasing you.
Yeah, sure, right?
But I would like to pause for one moment to contemplate what it must be like to be, I don't know, the kid singing Ave Maria's grandma. The doors squeak open in a grand manner because, of course, you slammed them open from either side like you're in a movie. Why wouldn't you? And then you, a crazed person covered in dirt, just throw some leg bones in and fucking leave.
Honestly, it's like a scene from Adventure Time, and I'm here for it.
I know, right? It's crazy. So why would we take anything in these books seriously when they're trying to sell that to us as an actual practice?
You know, this is reminding me of some of the like old botanicals, and like we would see things in like these really like older texts about like, oh yeah, this flower, it only opens under the full moon on a Tuesday on this one island where these magic fairies live. Like just this really fantastical like origin story for this plant. And when we kind of like look at that historically, it's because the people who are selling these plants are really wanting to make them seem like super cool and exotic so that they can charge maybe a little bit more money for them because this thing only blooms under a full moon on a Tuesday after all, right? So like I wonder how much of that type of stuff makes it into the Grimoire tradition as well, just depending on who the like intended audience for these books were too. It's like, yeah, sure, fancy rich dude, I can like do this spell to make that lady love you, but it's gonna take like a huge handful of rubies and a bunch of other stuff first, right? Like
You talking about plants made me think of Culpeper, and I had to reach for this book beside me. I have a first edition of the UK printing of Culpeper's Complete Herbal. It's not as fancy as I just made it sound. It just that's the specific one if you're trying to find it. Page 40, they're talking about basil, and they give just like a brief paragraph, and they end it very abruptly. I dare write no more of it. I don't know why that cracks me up every time.
I love it. Yeah, basil is a really fun one. There's all kinds of like fun lore surrounding it. Like in some contexts, it was thought to like produce scorpions. Definitely like considered like a holy plant in some parts of like Asia and everything. I love basil. Definitely one of my favorite plant allies.
Super crazy myth. It is featured in my upcoming book. It has a lot of connections to death, which is fascinating. But
Rad, okay.
nevertheless, back to your question. I'm just like way away from it. But so we have this crazy shit where we're throwing bones into the church or whatever. And like you said, obviously meant for a particular audience. This is meant to sound salacious and describe a pagan practice, and let me be specific, a non-Christian practice, as something sort of ugly and crazy and distasteful. Like this is clearly meant to look not great for the person doing it. And we're probably selling that to an audience of, let me check my notes, other Catholics. So it's definitely propaganda, right?
Yep.
Now, come a little forward in history, and we look at other people who talk about necromancy pretty heavily. We've got Eliphas Levi, John Dee, Kelly, right? Those are kind of our main guys. They all have something really specific in common. Do you know what that is?
They're all British and rich, and they were dudes and
Very all correct.
Sorry, what's that?
Every single one of them wanted to be a Catholic priest and failed at it.
Oh, I didn't know that fun tidbit. Okay.
It is a very specific tidbit. That's what they wanted to be, failed at it, landed somewhere just this side of occultism. So that's fun. They also are very sort of scared of the dead, right? So they talk about it in these really couched terms. And if you Google necromancy, one of the first things you'll find is a woodblock print of Kelly and Dee, I think, summoning a spirit. And they are inside the circle, and the spirit is outside of it. And they look sort of scared, and that's very funny because it's like a grandma in a nightcap ghost. And it's like, my man, what were you freaked out about? I don't understand.
And they're cowering inside their protective circle.
I know, it's very funny. They've got the ghost in the triangle, of course. It's like a whole thing. So we've got these guys sort of talking about it, and they're using really specific terms. Levy, for example, says that there are two kinds of necromancy. One that is done by blood and spells and imprecations. I love that $10 word, by the way. It means like cursing and hexing and also profanity. And I have dabbled in some imprecations once.
Yeah, I'm full of imprecations.
Once or twice, I think. And then there is the second, of course, which is done by incense and prayer and gifts. And I, of course, have only ever done the latter and recommend no one do the first or whatever. So he's sort of separating the good necromancy from the bad necromancy. And then we have Dee, who in the midst of talking about something else pauses for a sentence that it keeps me awake at night. I think about this sentence once in a while at like 2 a.m. It just popped into my head. He says, "The soul of a necromancer is moist and turgid. Period. End of sentence. goes on to talk about something else. He just sort of plops it in like occult Tourette's. He just sort of plops it in there.
And by the way,
By the way, the soul of a necromancer is moist and turgid. The end.
does your soul become moist and turgid through the practice of necromancy, or must one already have a moist, turgid soul to practice necromancy? I'm
I
wondering.
don't know. I lay there thinking about it. Do I need to get like some dry lock in there or a dehumidifier? What's
What
happening?
is the causal relationship here? Okay, yeah, this is a lot to think about.
Well, it's a lot to think about. So they obviously have some very strong feelings where they're dividing magic they feel comfortable with from magic that makes them uncomfortable, even if it is the same magic.
Mhm.
And that sort of brings us back around to something that Daniel Ogden says in Greek and Roman Necromancy, which is a great book. It's very chewy academic, but if you're into that thing, highly recommend. But he sort of talks about how whether or not necromancy is defined as good or bad is entirely dependent on the person practicing it and how they are perceived, even if the practices that they are participating in look identical.
Mm.
And that has historically always been true. So to sort of answer your question fully, ages later, because I guess that's what I'm doing today, if I wanted to dispel a stereotype about necromancy, I would want people to understand that those kinds of stereotypes have been sort of baked into our culture, where we're carrying together all of these sort of loaded fears and stereotypes and biases against not just death and the dead, but the people who work with those things, either in a practical or magical manner, be it the corporeal work of being a funeral director, or be it a magical practitioner who's using words that are seen as less than polite. Like, it's polite to say you are a medium or you do ancestor work, but it's not polite to say you're a necromancer, even though they are the same. So I would ask people to sit there and just sit with their own thoughts and consider where that fear is coming from, because the work isn't different. It's just the words that are. You could definitely follow that train of thought forward and say, immediately on the heels of Eliphas Levi, we have things like Mary Shelley writes the first sci-fi novel, and we have Frankenstein. Immediately after that, we have things like Penny Dreadfuls, which play with those ideas, the resurrected dead, and this leaks into things like early Dungeons and Dragons and then video games. And that idea that death is something distasteful is just sort of a stain we can't rub out of media now. So it leaks into our personal biases, and that's something worth evaluating.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually thinking when you said this that, the Dungeons and Dragons and that kind of like types of lore, I think, is a source of maybe negative press about necromantic work. There's, this is something that can happen in the game, and it's often looked at as being like, not a thing that good characters would necessarily be involved in or whatever. This is like, there's a lot of bias out there like baked into media, and this of course is something that can be a huge like feedback loop. I think that there have been people who have looked at these kind of propaganda portrayals of what a pagan practice might look like and then been informed by that, right, and like actually brought that into reality in a way that it never existed before. It was like, this dream of this Catholic person. And, but it's interesting how these things kind of can take on a life of their own in that way, too.
It is. It's very true. And like, one of the things I ask people to consider once in a while, if we're like checking biases, is like mediumship. People have feelings about that and they're specific, and ancestor work, same. But if we use the word Ouija board, suddenly even witches get nervous, which is very funny. But if we look at that historically, we don't see bad feelings about a Ouija board until a very specific singular day. Do you know what that day was?
I don't know. Did it have something to do with Ed and Lorraine Warren or something, though?
No, it was the day the movie The Exorcist hit theaters.
Oh, okay.
Because in the movie, it uses a Ouija board as the source of possession, even though that is not what happens in the book. They change it for the movie.
Okay.
The Ouija boards were very, very popular, and particularly prior to that, They were seen as just such a common, wholesome activity. You might play Ouija at church. Like, it was very, very pervasive in the culture. And it was so common in society, in fact, that on the May 29th edition of the Saturday Evening Post, Norman Rockwell, a person who only ever painted like wholesome domestic life, paints an image of a couple on a date playing Ouija. It was just a really, really common activity. And we're not talking about a Halloween edition of the Saturday Evening Post. It's May. And that should be really, really informing as to how people felt about that object until that movie came out. And it scared this entire generation of just like church moms into thinking this was how the devil was going to get into your house. So they're, burning them in bonfires in the town square and all this silly shit. And they taught their children to be afraid. So we really only have that fear in our society since like the 70s, which is such a short amount of time for everybody to have this deeply entrenched stereotype.
That is so fascinating too. And I'm thinking just in terms of like the movie makers here, maybe this was such a commonplace item that they were like, oh yeah, this is something that everybody has. Of course they would, sometimes using something which is very mundane and everyday and putting it into a different and scary context is like what horror is about, right? And so that makes a lot of sense.
But it would have been, for the time period, Ouija was as common and familiar as, like, they could have put Monopoly in there. It would have had basically the same impact in terms of how common that object was.
Honestly, Mortellus, Monopoly makes more sense as like a means of possession than Ouija. Like,
oh no, the spirit
that actually tracks.
Me.
Yes. I don't think I've ever finished. I don't think I've ever gotten through a game of Monopoly without rage quitting and immediately hating everybody I was playing with, which I think is the whole point of the game. It's supposed to the game design is supposed to sort of demonstrate the problems of capitalism. But yes.
Unfortunately, you have unlocked one of my favorite ADHD rambles, but that's not how Monopoly started.
Okay.
The original game was really, really different. It was called Monopoly, of course, and it was invented by a woman named Elizabeth Meiji, who wanted to create a game that talked about a social issue important to her. She invented it in 1902 and patented it in 1904. She sort of wanted to talk about economic privilege and land taxation and the economic consequences of those things on the average person. So you could play the game two ways. You either played as the average person who's just trying to rent a home or buy a home and exist, or you could play as an industrialist trying to have a monopoly. You could play it two different ways at once. When Parker Brothers bought the game, they removed the other element and made the capitalistic element the only feature of the game.
Interesting. Okay, so they probably said, well, why would you want to do anything but be an industrialist like us? Okay.
But the original title of the game was The Landlord's Game. Yeah.
It's fascinating. No, thank you. I appreciate that elucidation. Thank you.
You're welcome. Like the history of Monopoly, very, very fascinating. I think there's a wiki page. Definitely check that out. I love weird facts about history. I think keeping stories alive is also really fundamental to necromancy. Like, what an excellent way to honor Elizabeth Meiji's dream, to remember what she intended for that game.
Yeah, absolutely. Has anybody ever recreated the original?
Yes, you can actually find sort of bootleg versions of it online. Of course, Parker Brothers super doesn't like that. It doesn't like that. They both owned it at one point or another. But you can find it, and you can find the original rules. You can modify a Monopoly board to play it the way she intended.
Right. Very cool.
Yeah. Be living out a little necromancy of your own to go find the rules for Elizabeth's game and play it the way she intended.
I love that.
Yeah.
So this is a pretty common question that I ask guests. So if people who are completely new to this idea are curious to dip a toe in, what are some ways you might suggest people kind of start down this path?
I'm like the worst person to ask this question. That's terrible what I just said.
We can go to a different question. You don't have to answer it either. We can skip it.
It's a totally great question. I'm just a bad person to be answering it. That's the problem. I would say to your listeners that you're already doing necromancy. The line in the sand really is you reclaiming that word, just like we've reclaimed other words in the past, like witch or slut or queer. We take back words because they have power in them, regardless the stereotypes, right? Necromancy is a word like that. You are already doing those things. They're already part of your practice, but recontextualizing them and reclaiming the language is very powerful. Never forget that when you put gas in your car, you are powering that vehicle on the bones of animals you could never imagine meeting. So many small things in our lives every day are necromancy, and we just don't stop to consider. Look at what you're wearing right now. Odds are a good portion of your clothes are made from plants that are no longer living. The room you're likely sitting in is a lot of dead trees. You're probably surrounded by death right now where you are, and just never pause to have a moment with it. If you wanted to get started, just really just sit down and consider how death already affects your life and your practice, and just say, you know what, this is mine and I'm going to take it. It might be a word other people think is scary, but we know that's not what it means, and we're going to take it back and make it yours. And I wish that I could say, I am about to make so many people mad. I wish that I could say there are tons of books out there to go read and check out on the topic, but there really aren't. It's what inspired me to write my second book, because I wanted to put a resource out there that I wish had existed for myself, really. That's a very selfish way to put it, but honest in many ways, I suppose. But a lot of modern works on the topic fall into two camps. They're either incredibly academic and therefore difficult for the average person to sit down with, and they're definitely not going to be practice-based, or they're probably written by someone with a lot of eyeliner who enjoys Hot Topic very much. And that also describes me, but I am not homophobic. So there's a weird amount of like cishet gendered binary stuff in modern works about death magic. I don't know why that's a thing, but it is.
Yeah, there's so much just weird shit out there in modern currents too. That's just like, are we seriously not fucking done with this yet, y'all? But yeah.
Oh my God, I know, seriously. So yes, there are modern works out there. They're not all things I would recommend to you, but read them anyway. Read them. Maybe you totally disagree and you have a huge boner for the homophobic stuff you might find in them. That was so crude. I'm so sorry. Maybe you're into that though. Read them and maybe you'll find something great in there. There are a few I would caution you probably not to buy new. A lot of people would recommend Martin Coleman's Communing with the Spirits as sort of a seminal work. I would disagree on a few levels. It does have some of the wackiest passages ever in it though, so definitely read it for that. But when he passed away, he left the copyright to a person who is known to be a fascist. So if you buy it new, you're just giving that guy money. So don't do that.
Okay, yeah, that's a good tip, right? Sometimes, yeah, wanting to have access to the information in a book isn't the same as wanting to give the person who owns the copyright money.
Yes, even if they're only getting pennies every time you buy one, just probably don't.
The principle of it alone is, yes, for sure.
Getting a
for me, at least.
Getting a used copy is also necromancy. You're giving that book a new life. So
sure. Hell yeah.
But that book goes on an amusing ramble where he talks about what makes a necromancer. And there's sort of a
moistness and turgidity.
Yeah, I wish. This one's way weirder. I'm going to pull it off the shelf because it's much funnier to just read it to. If only you could see the tabs on this book. I just randomly opened to a page where it says that to be a medium, you must be a very passive person. So there's that. They say that if you are a woman, I'm very sorry for people like myself who are non-binary and are about to hear this with your own ears. Perfectly good ears. Here we go. The personal characteristics of a necromancer. I should take a picture of this page and send it to you because I'm going to do it.
Okay.
You just have to see how I feel about this page. It's crazy. There's a post-it on this page that says, I swear this book should make any person want to self-learn necromancy as a sheer act of defiance. I don't remember when I wrote that, but it remains true. Let's see. He does start this section by saying that only through placing yourself into the hands of a teacher and devoting yourself to the work and effort required by them will you be able to develop whatever ability to work with the spirits of the dead that you might wish to foster. It's not awesome. They go.
Yes, there's a lot of very
Yeah.
problematic.
It's crazy, crazy manipulative. It's a whole thing. But anyway, he's dead. We'll say it about him. He goes on to say on page 42 that women who work well with the spirits of the dead have a sharp sense of what they can get away with socially and have a tendency to spend most of their time living pretty close to the edge of social acceptability. They will enjoy shocking people, especially their friends and lovers. Many times they're accused by others of not taking life seriously. They will be uninhibited and have very little sense of physical modesty. I'm so sorry. And if you are a woman, you will have had vivid dreams of a sexual nature which you remember upon waking. In some cases, the dream will have been so vivid that you have awakened as a result of the orgasm that the dream produced. This goes on like this for like 2 pages.
He's like, oh yeah, and they're gonna be real slutty, and they're gonna have sexy dreams about me.
This follows immediately with this bit about how, like, and you must seek out a teacher, suspicious, exactly, specifically me, probably, and pay me money, and this will last for a long time, and you have to do all the stuff I say, right? Like, it's
And
super
this,
sketchy.
unfortunately, like, this is not something that is just in the past with dead people. I've had some, like,
Yeah.
really fucking gross experiences myself personally, like, wanting to be involved in magical groups and stuff like that. So, like, this type of shit is definitely still alive and well in the world, unfortunately.
I know, and I would be unfair if I didn't say he goes on to be just as crappy to quote unquote men, because we're skipping over anybody that's none of those two specific things, right? But he says that men will have a casual attitude toward human life, and goes on to say that men who work with the spirits of the dead are certainly never of the Casper Milquetoast school of masculinity. So, I mean, this guy has opinions.
Excuse me?
I know, right?
What does that mean, sir?
So it's not a book I would super recommend, and you definitely don't want the current copyright holder to have your money, but definitely read it. I think it's valuable to sort of see what other people thought about this kind of thing, because a wrong opinion, I mean, it might be a right opinion for you. It's wrong for me, but sometimes a wrong opinion can really inform you as to what you do want, what is important to you. Sometimes you don't know what you want your practice, your magic, your ethics, your morals, your own personal code of conduct to look like until you see somebody super fucking it up.
Sure. Yeah,
You're like,
that's a great
oh,
point. Yeah, absolutely.
I didn't know how strongly I felt about that until I saw this guy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've had experiences like that where I'm like, I didn't realize like that I cared this much about this until like I saw you doing such a bad job at it or something like that. So yeah.
And there are other books out there. I won't talk about all of them, but there's stuff, and you should read them all and decide for yourself if they're good or bad. I personally love the really chewy academic stuff, but that is very much not for everyone. I know that.
Sure, me too. Not everybody's a fucking power nerd like me, so yeah.
I know, right? And I think that's my level of neurospice. I saw a meme once that was like, are you the listen to songs on repeat kind of neurospicy, or the reads the dictionary for fun kind? And I was like, why not both?
Yeah, I'm like, what about if you're doing them both at the same time?
Yes, exactly. But I definitely recommend things like Ogden's Greek and Roman Necromancy, Lupito's The Return of the Dead. I really love The Magic of Rogues, even though it's arguable whether it'd be useful to you, but it specifically talks about a period during Tudor England, and it's just filled with this cast of wacky characters as it tells stories that relate to necromancy. It's where you'll learn fun things like this guy who got arrested. He's a musician who got arrested, and the sheriff or whatever took his drums to his home. He like seized the drums or whatever, and then this guy conjures up spirits that make the drums play all night, and it I guess is noisy and upsetting to the sheriff, so they give him his stuff back and he gets to leave. So, or the person who was hanged for, quote, practicing necromancy without a license, which sets up some very interesting possibilities in which one could get a license to practice necromancy. They were not hanged for doing witchcraft. They were hanged for doing witchcraft without a permit.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
I love the weirder stuff, I think.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I actually, one of my other podcasts is a history podcast that I make with my brother, and like it's so valuable to just sort of like we talk about some of like the bigger picture, like Western stuff, like trying to get my head around Western civilization and things like that.
One of my favorite like soapboxes is temperance movement foods.
I love that.
Did you know that not one of, America's first like definable cult was centered around graham crackers?
I had kind of heard that a little bit. Like I don't know the whole story, but I know the dude's name was Graham and it was all about like not masturbating and stuff like that, right? Wasn't it like some kind of sexual purity thing?
It was Sylvester Graham, and Sylvester Graham wanted to invent a food that was sort of ideal so that people could like get back to their work and they wouldn't have time to masturbate or whatever. He invented graham crackers, which are nothing like what we eat today. I took the recipe from his book, A Treatise on Bread, which I own for reasons mysterious. I have an original copy of A Treatise on Bread. It is wacky. It's super, super wacky. You can read it at the Internet Archive if you're interested. Somebody has scanned it up. But so I recreated the recipe. They're super gross and boring. But I don't know how. They didn't have cable then, I guess. They just attracted this whole throng of people who moved to an area. They had a commune. They were called Grahamites, and they lived basically a vegan diet. It was all purity and celibacy or whatever, and good health and hard work and whatever their thing was. And then they all ceased existing. Sylvester Graham was so staunchly adamant in his belief that he would one day become like an icon of the temperance movement and an icon of like upright behavior, that he in his own lifetime preserved his house because he thought it would be like a historical landmark or whatever. And I joke very, very often that one of my like bucket list items is to go to that dude's house and like watch Pornhub and eat s'mores on the porch or something.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to go there and do dirty things.
I've never been so convinced that I wanted to do something awful in a place. But
Well, that sounds like a worthwhile pilgrimage to make.
But yeah, I think food history is really, really fascinating. Super fascinating.
Yeah. Well, this has been super cool. I really appreciate you taking the time to hang out and elucidate all these things. I've learned so much today. Is there anything that you would like to talk about that I haven't asked you about, or is there any questions you would like to ask me?
Oh my God. Well, one, if your listeners are hearing this portion, I would want them to know that I'm actually a respectable person who says wise things occasionally. I'm not always a jackass. I apologize for whatever this has been today. But I have had fun, and that's what counts a lot, I think.
I think it's been super fun. And as we talked about before we started recording, it's been kind of a hectic week for both of us. And like, I think it's been cool to sort of take a pause from all the chaos and appreciate death and all of its, the different perspectives that we can have on that and all that that can offer us.
Indeed. And I think, what was it? I joked in an email to you that this episode should be called Cloudy with a Chance of Chaos because it's been such a week.
Right?
But what would I want people to know? Gosh, I'm going to be at a super cool event coming up in November. If you are in or want to be in the Virginia area near Triangle, Virginia, it's just a very thoughtful, neat little event where they care a whole lot about inclusivity and diversity and access and taking care of folks, and proud to be a part of it this year and be their featured presenter. And one of the great things about this particular event is that they keep sort of a narrow schedule. So there's only 2 classes at a time and everybody stops for meals together, which is awesome. Sometimes big events, you don't know what class to go to because there's so much happening at one time, but you get a lot of really specific time with whatever you're most interested in at this event. It's called Hallowed Homecoming, a Samhain retreat. It's got a centering around death and ancestral work and Samhain hallows generally. So it's just a really cool event. I'm glad to be a part of it.
Very cool.
The second weekend, I believe, of November. And it's just occurring to me if this is going to come out so close to that. Everyone will just have to hear about it after the fact, I suppose. But I'll also be at a few events coming up in the spring. I have a post pinned to the wall of my Patreon that has my upcoming events and stuff. And yeah, I'm just excited to meet all your listeners. I'm glad to have been here. As for you, I do have questions for you. I've very much enjoyed chatting with you, and I'm curious what inspired you to start a podcast.
Oh, well, so I've always sort of liked the kind of like medium of talk radio. I grew up listening to a lot of coast to coast type stuff and like things like that. And I've always, fantasized about having something like that, which kind of explains the format of my show. I try to make it very much like radio sounding because I enjoy that. But the other sort of like more personal aspect of it was that there were a lot of places in my life where I felt like there wasn't space for my voice to be heard. I'm sort of a soft-spoken, quiet person. A lot of other reasons, like there's some gender stuff mixed in there as well, of course. But like I really wanted to try to find a way to like create a space for myself where I would be able to like, have a space for my voice to be heard. There wouldn't necessarily be like other people arguing with me or talking over me because I'm quiet or whatever. I could have that sort of control over that situation through the editing process and stuff too. So I think, yeah, just really wanting to find a space to share my thoughts and to also connect with people that share the very niche interests that I have, which I've done today. And this is just like one of the joys of doing this type of work is just being able to connect with people that are like, that also like what I would consider to be very strange, but also very interesting things.
Yeah, I have a lot of respect for that. I think there's something to be said for becoming a magnet for the kind of weirdos a younger you really could have needed. I see where you're coming from, and I think in a lot of ways many of us do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's a sort of, gift that we can give to ourselves in the past and also people in the future, I suppose, right? Like some of my work involves the idea of connecting with the different versions of myself as they like stretch across time and stuff. And like, I can sort of have this assuredness that the me from the future is helping, from there as I'm helping from the past, because we're all sort of holding hands and helping each other, which I suppose could be contextualized as quasi-necromantic in its way.
It is. We could probably do another hour on like parts of the soul and like my thoughts. I'll spare you though.
But yeah, just sort of the idea of wanting to sort of like put that out there. And it's been, I think, one of the most rewarding parts about the show is like, having the feedback from people and hearing that like, there was things about it that were helpful for them in sort of like approaching their practices or getting them over humps or whatever. So yeah, that's the real joy of it is having that kind of feedback and knowing that it's doing what I'm hoping it's supposed to do. So yeah.
I think one of the most fun things for me as an author, and everyone should know that just every author you ever read is probably some weird hermit who's like, oh no, I have to talk to people like every time. And that's for sure me. But I never know when I go onto an interview for the first time, if it's my first time being on a podcast or something, you don't know how you're going to connect with that person. If it's about to be the most awkward conversation you ever had, or very sad and deep, or silly like today. But every single one finds something different in you. And I think that's a gift that people like yourself give to the world, where you take the hermity weirdos like myself and you just sort of dig in and find an interesting thread to pull. And I really do think that adds something to the human experience.
Thank you. Yeah, and I definitely can identify with being a hermity weirdo myself. And so hermity weirdos of the world unite.
You'll get membership cards or something.
Well, Mortellus, this has been fantastic. Is there any last words or advice that you would like to offer the listeners? And I'll also ask you to share, like, where can people find your work and all that good stuff?
Yeah, I often say, and I don't know why it just like scares people, so live with that, I guess. But if this is the last interview I ever do, and these are the last words that anybody hears from me, that I hope you'll take something from what I said today and take it out into the world and make it count. And do the same for yourself.
Okay.
As for how to find me, if you search Mortellus or A Crow and the Dead on basically anywhere that isn't Twitter, you will find me. Look at me ragging on Twitter today a bunch. But
Twitter, never heard of her.
Never heard of her. Yeah, I'm around and I'm always happy to chat with folks. Come find me and say hi.
All right, fantastic. Well, this has been very, very cool. I really, really appreciate it. All right, thanks so much to Mortellus for joining me. Check out the show notes to find links to acrowandthedead.com and their work.
Shortly after we recorded, I got word from Lonnie Scott over at Weird Web Radio that Mortellus had been hit by one of the big storms that came through the southeastern US this fall. I hope that the recovery efforts are going well and that things are getting back to normal, or whatever fucking passes for it these crazy days. You can help support Mortellus getting back on track from that storm by donating money to them on PayPal at A Crow and the Dead. If you like the show and you like what I've got going on here, you can support it on Patreon, which will entitle you to receive a bibliomancy reading from me. We're actually going to be hearing one of those in a little while. Making this show is, of course, a pretty wild amount of work, especially for just one intrepid podcaster, but it means a lot to me to be able to do it. So thank you so much to the people who are making that possible by giving on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee, and to the people who are supporting the show by spreading the word. Tell all your friends, allies, and magical associates about it, as well as everybody you meet at the next ceremonial potluck or esbot or event you attend. You can also post about it on social media or write a positive review where that's possible. All of these things are super helpful, so thank you so much to everybody who is supporting the show in whatever way that looks like, especially listening. Thank you for being here. And yes, don't forget to smash the fucking shit out of that follow button so you can get updates about when new episodes come out. All right, let's get into some listener mail and shoutouts. Shout out and much love to all the pocket wizards and mushrotters. Wherever I roam, I know I do not roam alone, and I find that to be such a blessing. Gratitude. Thanks especially to the Intrepid mod team who has been working especially hard recently. I really appreciate everybody's diligence and integrity and all of the rest of it. Gratitude. Shout out to Grant. Thank you so much for the support and the kind words. Much appreciate it. Shout out to Lance Criminal Galen. Thank you for the kind wishes. I hope that the bird feeding goes very well. Shout out once again to Rocket, who was the one who translated that Cloud Cobb poem that you heard at the beginning of the show. You can hear Rocket in episode 70, Spinoza and the Sexy Dangers of Pantheism, Transdivinity, and Agdistis. A few episodes ago, in number 90 with Lee Harrington, I talked about artists Claude Ka and Marcel Moore and their political art project, The Soldier with No Name. This was something I first heard about while taking a class with Rocket this summer. Rocket let me know that they had written a piece about the soldier with no name and some other stuff, which is called That Which Wishes to Articulate Itself in You, Dokyat, Gender Euphoria, The Cut-Up Method, and Sacred Pleasure in Anarchist Jewish Mysticisms. I put a link to that PDF in the show notes in case you'd like to check it out. Rocket also let me know that they had translated some of Claude Ka's poetry, which you heard a bit of at the top of the show. Shout out to Kay Green, and happy birthday coming up soon. It's a big one. Many thanks for the well wishes, and all hail Discordia. Hope everything continues to go well. Shout out to Gin and Juice. Hope you had a very fun and spooky birthday. Shout out to Claudius on Discord, who let us know that when I mentioned the random number generation step in episode 90, they were reminded of the Amulet of Entropy, which uses environmental sensors to produce random results. As much as anything can really be called random, as we kind of talked about back then. Claudius notes that they ran into it from their subscription to HackerBox, but you can find a link to the Amulet of Entropy in the show notes. Shout out to Tyler, who asked what I thought was a pretty interesting question on Instagram. Instagram isn't really suited to having nuanced debates about, philosophy and shit like that because of all of the character limits and whatnot. So I said that I would go ahead and address it here. So Tyler asks, you're a chaos magician. Do you welcome the inevitable collapse or do you try to stall it? So thank you so much. The short answer is that I don't really necessarily accept any of the premises upon which this question is asked. There's the explicit one that we need to choose between stalling or welcoming and, quote, inevitable collapse. I'm kind of curious about what. I'm guessing of society or whatever. Or the implicit one that's offered, that chaos magicians would have some higher stakes or privileged perspective about this dichotomy that's been drawn in this question. I also don't really fully accept that anything is actually inevitable except maybe death and taxes. But that's also a matter of the scale at which we choose to look at things. I mean, the heat death of the universe is a thing or whatever. I don't know. So I'm not going to get into that part of it because we would be here all day. But I do feel like there seems to be somewhat of a misunderstanding about chaos magic, at least the way that I understand it, built into the thinking of this question. So I think it might be interesting to kind of unpack this here. There's a couple different things going on, but I'm going to address the magic stuff before getting into the more like political or philosophical stuff. The way that I define chaos magic and think about it as a magical system or paradigm, and I would offer that it is its own magical paradigm, or you could consider it to be one. That's a matter of semantics, of course, though. But basically, this all has to do with understanding magic as being a sort of principle or property in the world in which we live. Of course, there's a lot of different ways this can play out, giving rise to these different ideas of the models of magic and all of the rest of it. But basically, magic is part of the complex system of our reality. The models that exist for describing and working with complex systems, like the ones we find everywhere in our reality, things like the stock market or ecosystems or water dripping, like these can be described with complex nonlinear dynamics, chaos theory. The book Chaos, Making a New Science by James Gleick is actually a really good and accessible pop science book that goes into some of this stuff. You can check out The Fractal Geometry of Nature by Benoit Mandelbrot if you're like a fucking power nerd like me and you're into that shit or whatever. But there are some interesting things like about the way that all of these systems have stuff in common, and we can kind of like draw these understandings about the like what's going on behind the scenes of reality, if you will. I'm getting lost in the weeds here, but anyway, to me, chaos magic from the standpoint of magical theory isn't about creating chaos or necessarily about capitalizing on chaos. It's about understanding the subtle workings of the world and using that information to your magical advantage, whatever that looks like many systems of magic are. Chaos magic has the advantage of being able to reconcile modern ways of sense-making about the world using things like scientific and psychological models to explain our experiences along with older ways of thinking about the world, like stuff about supernatural forces or spirits or gods or whatever. So being able to reconcile these two things I think is really cool and powerful, another thing I like about it. You can use any system of magic to create chaos when it comes to the reality we live in. When we look at history, it's more oftentimes the fundamental versions of various organized religions of the world that are creating the most chaos. So I kind of reject the assumption that chaos magicians would have any special stakes or privileged perspective about forestalling or welcoming what you've called, Tyler, an inevitable collapse simply because the word chaos is in the name of the magical system. To the other premise about choosing to embrace or forestall this collapse, I also reject this dichotomy, as I said. When we look at complex systems, again, like the ones we find in the reality in which we live in, it's usually not really the case that we find a system completely in collapse or completely thriving or whatever. Things actually hover around a dynamic equilibrium. This is demonstrated by a strange attractor in chaos theory or whatever, if you want to get into it. But it's not typically the case that everything is fucked or everything is great. There's always going to be a sort of mix and dynamism and a push and a pull. So I think that some things are going to fail and be replaced by other things, as we would see in any ecosystem or other types of systems, economic systems and whatnot. Personally, I embrace the changes that lead to more freedom and equality, and I resist those that seek to disenfranchise and exploit people. And if a big collapse happened, like a big societal collapse, to me, by my reckoning, only the most privileged members of our society would be doing anywhere close to all right. And I'm sure that they would be just fucking fine with it if they were chill and the rest of us were totally fucked. Throughout history, it's often been the case that revolution has led to an increased amount of power being held by the state. The idea of welcoming or helping to create some type of collapse would likely mean welcoming or helping to create a more authoritarian style of government, and this, I believe, is what is at the secret heart of many who are welcoming a so-called inevitable collapse. Though I'm certainly not putting this on you personally, Tyler. That would be fucking wild. This is big picture stuff. I'm going to go ahead and read from one of my favorite sources. I say a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but also not, because so many people are constantly checking on it and fact-checking it and whatnot. Wikipedia. We're going to get into the term accelerationism, because I think that this is the territory we are playing in here. All right, so let's take a look. The term accelerationism originated with the sci-fi author Robert Zelazny in his third novel, 1967's Lord of Light. Accelerationism is a range of revolutionary and reactionary ideas in left-wing and right-wing ideologies that call for the drastic intensification of capitalist growth, technological change, infrastructure sabotage, and other processes of social change to destabilize existing systems and create radical social transformations, otherwise referred to as acceleration. It has been regarded as an ideological spectrum divided into mutually contradictory left-wing and right-wing variants, both of which support the indefinite intensification of capitalism and its structures, as well as in the conditions of a technological singularity, a hypothetical point in time at which technological growth becomes uncontrollable and irreversible. There's a couple different definitions of that singularity. This is Lux again, but we can get into that another time. Back to Wikipedia. Various ideas, including stuff in Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's ideas about deterritorialization, Jean Billard's proposals for fatal strategies, and aspects of the theoretical systems and processes developed by English philosopher and Dark Enlightenment commentator Nick Land, are crucial influences on accelerationism, which aims to analyze and subsequently promote the social, economic, cultural, and libidinal forces that constitute the processes of acceleration. While originally used by the far left, the term has, in a manner strongly distinguished from the original accelerationist theories, been used by right-wing extremists such as neo-fascists, neo-Nazis, white nationalists, white supremacists, etc., to increasingly refer to an acceleration of racial conflict through assassinations, murders, and terrorist attacks as a means to violently achieve a white ethno-state. Thank you, Wikipedia! I think many of the people who are advocating for collapse might not realize the wild perspective of privilege they might be doing it from when we consider how fucked a lot of people would be without things like medical care and pharmaceutical drugs and shit like that. When we unpack it, we can easily come to a sort of survival of the fittest type of situation, which fits in very well with some of these fascist ideologies that Wikipedia talks about at the end of the article there. So it's not really surprising that we see accelerationism joining hands with the far right. It's sort of funny to me about this notion of social survival of the fittest. This is a huge side note. It's just interesting how that sort of flies in the face of the actual reality in which we live. Survival of the fittest in terms of like how it actually takes place in the real world in nature requires diversity and mutation and crossbreeding and things getting fucking weird in order to happen. Monoculture, a lack of genetic diversity and things like that, can lead to sudden failures of entire crops or the collapse of entire animal populations. So in a nutshell, as far as I can tell, ideologies which are incongruent with the reality in which we live, or which privilege other imagined realities, whether that's the eternal life in heaven or abandoning the planet we're on and for one that we haven't fucked up yet, are in many ways sort of existential threat to us as a species. Thanks so much to Tyler for this awesome question. I know I got pretty far into the weeds there just based on that very short question you asked, but you obviously triggered something within me, so thank you. I really do love getting into this stuff, so thank you for the opportunity. Later on during Final Thoughts, I'd like to circle back to the idea of these libidinal forces that Wikipedia mentions as being one of the means by which these accelerationist agendas are sort of like pushed. And I want to examine what that might mean for us in our magical practice. Before we get into that, though, as promised, let's take a short listener-supporter bibliomancy break. Jay Aaron, who you can find on Instagram at digmygrave24, asked about some Hecatian work. Let's listen. Greetings, and this is Lexa here to do your bibliomancy reading. I see that your question is that you have been recently working with Hecate a little bit more, leaving offerings and prayers and things like that, and have developed a little bit of like a ritual practice. You note that that's taking place in the woods and stuff. Sort of asking, how does one know if you are doing things right? So I can really, really relate to this. Actually, when I first started working with Hecate, this was something that I was really concerned about because I hadn't done a lot of that specific type of deity work before. And so I remember feeling a lot of, insecurity around this and a lot of unsureness. So I can totally relate with this question. Let me go ahead and see what text we will be consulting today. In addition to asking Eris, I will also ask Hecate to help us with this specific divination. Alright, ladies. Which text will we consult? Number 1 from Bank 6. Winter's Tale by Mark Halperin. Gorgeous book. Okay, I'm going to go grab that and I will be right back. Alright, I have returned. I've got Winter's Tale by Mark Halperin. It's a really interesting novel with a lot of interesting shit in it. It's been kind of influential on me in my magical practice as well. Hail Hecate and Hail Eris. What insights can y'all provide for as ideas about whether or not what is being offered and achieved in the current deity work practice is satisfactory? Is it doing it for you? Is there things that could be done better or worse or whatever? Please let us know. And shortly before they might have been discovered, had retreated to await a more propitious moment. The expressions of the men and women of that era, surviving in photographs, seemed all-knowing, and the subjects of the portraits seemed to peer through time and know the innermost thoughts of those who studied their images decades after they had died. Such faces and eyes, constructed of light and truth, did not any more exist. Gratitude. Hail Eris and hail Hecate. What's coming through for me here is that it sounds like things are clicking and things are going along just fine. The idea of having pictures around of people who have lived before us speaks a lot to ancestor work to me, which is something that I also do as part of my Hecatean practice, Hecate being, liminal goddess who is a shepherdess, a psychopomp between this world and others. So that perhaps is something that if you would like to add in to your practice, that sounds like it is being suggested. I've found personally that Hecate has been really flexible with me. I have a background in science. I think that there's some of these lenses that I've spent a lot of time in that way, these systems that have made my thinking a little bit rigid in some ways. Like there are places in my practice where I really do like to have tangible evidence and quote proof of things, because that's just makes it helpful for me to kind of connect. And so Hecate's been really cool about offering what I need as an individual to come to the work. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there as well, that sometimes if there's a way that you're not being able to connect as an individual, asking for that in your practice is a way to actually get it. So I wasn't sure if it would work like that, but for me so far it has, and that's been something that I really, really feel grateful about and appreciate and try to share with others in case it might be helpful for them as well. Well, regardless of where and when this finds you, I hope it finds you well, and I really appreciate the support. I hope that your endeavors with this work goes well, and I hope that you find it as rewarding as I have. All right, cheers. Right on. Thanks so much to everybody who's reached out and who's been supporting the show by rating, reviewing, and giving on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. Know that whether or not it was featured today, all of the missives that I receive are appreciated. Thank you so much for all of the kind words and wishes people have been sending my way. If you'd like to send me thoughts, questions, comments, or suggestions for the listener mailbag, you can reach me at luxoccultpod@gmail.com. Find me on Instagram at luxoccultpod, or on Blue Sky at luxestrada919. A quick programming note. I mentioned last time that I was going to be slowing down a little bit for the winter, which is still going to be the case, hopefully. There's also been a new development since that time when I recorded, which for me will involve selling a home and moving across the country. I'm going to be incredibly busy attending to concerns of a domestic nature until we're able to get settled in our new place. This being said, the Lux Occult podcast is important to me and will continue on. I still have a bunch of rad conversations that I have yet to produce and share with you all, and there are some very cool plans for the future. I'm actually really, really excited about this. I just wanted to let you all know that so that people could have reasonable expectations about my availability and stuff during this transitional time. It's likely going to be a little while. But yeah, so I just wanted to let people know that I might not be around quite as much because I am doing domestic stuff, but the podcast will absolutely continue. Don't forget to grab your copy of Serpents of Circe. Really excited to be included in that project. You can find links to that in the show notes. I just really want to say I appreciate so much all of the help and support from both seen and unseen sources. Gratitude, Void, and Hail Hecate. Before we get into final thoughts here, I do want to mention that I am not speaking from the standpoint of a mental health care provider or anything like that. What I'm about to share with you all are my own observations and experiences and hypotheses about things. This is pretty much always the case on the show, right? I say in the beginning I only speak for myself, but it bears repeating sometimes, especially when you get into certain complicated things like this. Okay, the term libidinal forces came up in that Wikipedia article about accelerationism earlier. Let's take a look at what that word means, these libidinal tides. It has to do with libido, which hits my ear as being sort of like a late 90s term. I say sort of dating myself, I guess. In common vernacular, though, it typically refers to somebody's sex drive, their horny level or whatever. But let's look a little bit closer at a dictionary definition, which lets us know that the word libido comes from the Latin for lust or desire. So Sigmund Freud took the word and applied it to his own theories and ideas about things. So Freud first defined the libido to mean the instinctual energy associated with the sex drive, basically the procreation instinct to make more people. He later broadened the word's meaning and began to use it to mean things about the mental energy behind purposeful human activity of any kind, like a sort of like life energy. In other words, the libido, for which Freud also used the term eros, a Greek word referring to sexual love, came to be regarded for Freud as a sort of life instinct, which included sex along with other impulses we rely on to keep us alive. He called the opposite instinct, the one that creates self-destructive impulses and is associated with anger and sadism and aggression, thanatos. The idea that libidinal forces, those connected with what Freud called eros and thanatos, can be used as a lever by which humans can manipulate or influence one another is not really a new or very controversial idea. It's kind of central to modern marketing, where the aim is to identify the, quote, pain point of your target and then offer a solution. Here's an example. Your husband would probably pay attention to you again if you use this shampoo. It's a sort of, wouldn't you like to eat this nice carrot kind of thing. The way that many religious groups maintain power is kind of adjacent, but there's more of like an overt stick in this carrot-stick dichotomy, if you will. Here's an example. You're going to go to hell or be horribly punished unless you do what we say. So for religion, telling people what to do in the bedroom and sometimes what to do in other areas of life often seems to be a big part of this kind of like structure of social control or organization or however you want to think about it. For advertisers, this is also present, but I think it takes more subtle forms. People who have experimented with using the energies associated with sexual activity or arousal or whatever for magical purposes might have noticed that this stuff can be pretty powerful. Also things having to do with like deep emotions like rage or anger or joy or happiness or anything like that. From a psychological perspective, stuff which involves us continuing on surviving either as an individual or as a species is baked in pretty deep in terms of our brain structure. Definitely speaking out of turn here, and I'm not an expert on this. This is just kind of the common thinking on this stuff. But things like fear and lust and anger, the longing for safety and love and understanding, these things are deep and powerful currents. And through influence techniques, they can be used to control people, especially people who aren't yet able to kind of own or take note of or take inventory of their own fear and lust and anger and the rest of it. So sex negativity is an example, like this idea of shaming people for natural biological stuff as being a very effective and common strategy for controlling people. Another example is causing people to be afraid and angry, or taking advantage of their desire to belong or build a better world. These things can all be levers and things that we do see if we look out into the world as being ways that people are sometimes manipulated by other people. So to operate from a locus of our own control, like to operate from a standpoint where we're the ones making the choices about our lives or other things, whether this is magically or otherwise, it's helpful to be able to be the one with your own hands on these levers, these things about fear and anger and love and lust and the rest of it. In order to do this, at least for me, it's been necessary to kind of sit with and understand and maybe even become friends with my own fear and lust and anger and longing for safety and love and understanding and all of the rest of it, or to discover the ways that these things can become teachers. These things can be like super uncomfortable, right, to like look at or sit with or whatever, and there can be a lot of stigma attached with doing so in some cases, and it's something that you do want to take a lot of care and precaution with, because, you know, whenever we're fucking around with something powerful, it also has the potential to be dangerous. So this is actually something we talked about in our consent and magic courses with Consent Academy. But anyway, these things can be incredibly useful too. So, and if you're not using them for yourself, I assure you that somebody else probably is in some way. So for me, I've gained a lot of ground in this area of, you know, having my hands on these levers for myself or whatever, of maintaining sovereignty of self by conducting some pretty, I don't know, ruthless self-examination, as well as some pretty intentionally approached efforts towards gaining more forgiveness and love for the parts of myself I'm less fond of. And it's allowed for a lot of positive change and growth to occur and to continue to occur. This is an ongoing process. Therapy and my kink and magical practices have all been places where I've been able to discover and find good circles of protection to dance with these demons in, if we want to call them demons. Some of these things partake in that death drive, that thanatos that Freud talks about, things like rage, the scream I've been holding in my entire life. Some partake in what Freud would call eros, maybe the soft, naive heart that would make excuses for my abusers or whatever. And I have in the past, when I was, I think, less wise, attempted to sort of cut the things away that I didn't like about myself, to sort of permanently, banish these demons or whatever. But through experimentation, I have learned that the path to wholeness and power does not include cutting away pieces of the landscape of self. I mean, at least not for me. Now, because I'm willing to dance with these demons, if we want to call them that, while still keeping them in their magical circles, these things that used to cause me kind of a lot of trouble increasingly now work for me. And I want to know how grateful I am that this type of work, just getting into these areas of deep reflection, has been available to me. It's something that anybody can probably do if they choose to, but I'm given to understand that the ability to actually make that choice is more accessible to some people than to others. It takes a lot of different things, some of them being courage and a willingness to look at all the things you might have been hiding about yourself from yourself, and to take accountability for what you find, and to forgive yourself so you can do better, and to be ready for this process to take the rest of your life if that's the time it's going to take. So if this is work that you're attempting in some fashion to try to kind of take a step back and look at stuff in an effort to make improvements, please give yourself credit for the strength and bravery that it requires, and go easy and gentle and take your time and all of the rest of it, and please don't be harder on yourself than you would be on a friend. And if you have access to mental health care, finding a good therapist can be a fucking game changer. The mushroom and its current, which seems particularly well suited to support this type of work, have also been incredibly helpful. And I'd like to express the gratitude that I feel for all of the insights I've been able to gain along this dark path that we've walked together. Whatever you're doing out there to operate more from the locus of your own magical control, I want to remind you to resist and share the Green Mushroom Project's statement of resistance. Resist. Resist by maintaining sovereignty of the self. Resist by maintaining love of the self. Resist by maintaining fierce loyalty to love and pleasure. Resist with acts of radical kindness. Focus on the path to better times. Fuck yeah. Thanks so much to Mortellus and CJ Lane for joining me. Check out the show notes for links to all of the awesome stuff that we talked about today. Gratitude for all the kind words and support for the show and my other work. I appreciate it. Thank you all so much. And most of all, thanks so much to you for listening. Much love. This is Lux Estrada, reminding you to stay strong and stay fucking curious. Alright, I'm going to leave you all with one of the earlier pieces of sound magic that I produced. It's a little clumsy, it's a little rough around the edges, but it still holds a sentimental place in my heart. Hope you enjoy it. Here's Dynamo. Delta, Victor, Mike, November, Delta, Romeo, Hotel, Whiskey, Romeo, November, Golf, Tango, Romeo, Sierra. In shining fire we stand opposing dawn, the falling stars of 1,000 dreamless years. The nights awake and alive with breath, your eyes alight with impossible colors. I've pulled out my rib and given it to myself to create anew that which breaks but is not broken. Lao Tzu wrote that the Tao gives birth to the one gives birth to the two gives birth to the three gives birth to the 10,000 things. Tango, Whiskey, Lima, Delta, Victor, Mike, November, Delta, Romeo, Hotel, Whiskey, Romeo, November, Golf, Tango, Romeo, Tango, Romeo, Sierra, Victor. Behold, a perennial prestige, continual revelation, the destruction of birth, cutting through the skin of what is with the scalpel of what will be, the work of the sword of process and its attendant cup. I have made an object of power discovered in another world, and been the petty demiurge to land's burst of the mind. I have died, lived, and caught a glimpse of the elusive reflection of time, but none of it is as great as the mysteries contained in a single drop of ink. Crowley wrote, "With the wand createth he, with the cup preserveth he, with the dagger destroyeth he, with the coin redeemeth he." Is what we build created or discovered, or are there vast and storied boundaries between these lands? Dreams constructed lucidly from bricks of story and song, in a place where all is reduced to a symbol of itself. Shapes with too many dimensions to carry back from the wilderness of these borderlands. Though we may have caught sight of the beast we stalk, let us not be consumed by this hunt, carving whales from soap to be dissolved in the currents of the years. Let us walk with upward gaze upon these paths, embracing fear as a brother, and wield our weapons wisely, carving out space to iterate. Whiskey, Romeo, November, Golf, Tango, Romeo, Tango, Romeo, Sierra, Victor, Bravo. Whiskey, November, Lima, Whiskey, Sierra, Foxtrot, Romeo.
Lux Occult is part of the Green Mushroom Podcast Network.
What scares you?
Ghosts,
Aliens,
Monsters?
the occult.
conspiracies.
Some of you like to be scared, and unearthing paranormalcy is for you.
Some of you try everything you can to avoid it. Unearthing paranormalcy is for you.
We take the topics that scare some, and we dig in to find the source, then present the history to make the paranormal a little more normal.
We also throw in a bit of comedy to shed a light on some of the darkness in the world.
So whether you're scared of bumps in the night, what's inside your own mind, or strange lights in the sky, we cover it all.
We dig in and present all that we find and try to come up with some logical
And not so logical.
reasons for the high strangeness happenings.
Sometimes we are scared of the things we don't understand. And the more we understand, the less we fear.
So find us, Unearthing Paranormalcy, on your favorite podcast app. And join us on Facebook, Instagram, and Discord at UMP Normalcy. And until next time.
Keep digging.